What if the ground beneath your feet is holding memories far older than anything you were ever taught in school? What if the story of this planet, the one printed in textbooks and whispered through museums, is only the most recent chapter of something immeasurably longer, and the earlier pages were torn out before anyone alive today learned how to read? Tonight, let that question rest gently at the edge of your mind. Do not chase it. Let it drift the way fog drifts over water at dawn. Slow and soft, carrying shapes you almost recognize but cannot name. So before you let your body sink fully into the comfort of wherever you are right now, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And if you feel like it, share where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I would love to know which corner of the world is falling asleep to these words tonight. In the year 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis sat in a room in Constantinople and finished compiling a map of the world. It was not an ordinary map. Drawn on gazelle skin, coloured in careful inks, the chart depicted the western coastline of Africa, the eastern coastline of South America, and, far to the south, something that should not have been there at all. Along the bottom of the map, rendered with a precision that still unsettles cartographers to this day, lay a detailed outline of a landmass that closely resembles the northern coastline of Antarctica. Not the Antarctica we know today, a continent smothered beneath nearly 2 miles of ice, but the coastline as it would appear if the ice were removed entirely, exposing the bare rock beneath. This is the detail that refuses to be explained away. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 3 centuries after Piri Reis drew his map, and the subglacial topography of the continent, the actual shape of the land hidden under the ice, was not confirmed by modern seismic surveys until the middle of the 20th century. So the question becomes very simple and very uncomfortable. How did a 16th century admiral draw a coastline that no one in recorded history had ever seen? Piri Reis himself offered an answer, though it only deepens the mystery. In annotations written along the margins of his map, he explained that he had compiled his chart from approximately 20 older source maps. Some of these, he said, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, the 4th century before the Common Era. Others, he hinted, were even older. He did not invent the geography he drew, he copied it. He was a compiler, not a discoverer. And whatever original sources he worked from, maps so ancient they may have predated Greek civilization, have since disappeared entirely. They are not housed in any archive, they are not referenced in any surviving catalogue. They are simply gone like so many other fragments of the deep past, dissolved into the silence between what we remember and what we have been allowed to forget. In 1966, a professor of history at Keene State College in New Hampshire, named Charles Hapgood, published a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. In it, Hapgood argued that the Piri Reis map, along with several other medieval and Renaissance-era maps, could only be explained by the existence of a sophisticated, globe-spanning civilization that had mapped the Earth thousands of years before the rise of Sumer or Egypt. Hapgood was not a fringe thinker shouting from the margins. I was a respected academic, and his work caught the attention of someone whose endorsement carried extraordinary weight. Albert Einstein, in the final years of his life, wrote a foreword to an earlier book by Hapgood on the theory of Earth crust displacement, praising the clarity and rigour of his reasoning. Einstein did not endorse every conclusion Hapgood reached, but he took the question seriously enough to lend his name to the conversation, and that, perhaps, is the detail worth holding. When one of the most celebrated minds in human history looks at the same evidence and says, this deserves investigation, it becomes much harder to dismiss. The Piri Reis map is not alone. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 also depicts Antarctica, this time showing rivers and mountain ranges on a continent that, by every conventional account, had been buried under ice for millions of years. The Boichet map of 1739 goes even further, showing Antarctica as 2 separate landmasses divided by a waterway, a detail not confirmed until modern ice-penetrating radar revealed that Antarctica is, in fact, an archipelago beneath its frozen shell. Each of these maps appears to draw from source material that predates the cartographer's own era by thousands of years, and in each case the source material has vanished. There is a pattern here, one that will surface again and again throughout this story. Knowledge appears in the historical record, astonishing, inexplicable knowledge, and then disappears. It emerges briefly like a shape glimpsed through deep water, and then the surface closes over it again. The maps survive, but the civilizations that first produced the data are gone. The copies endure, but the originals are lost. And no institution, no academy, no governing body has ever been able to satisfactorily explain how navigators in the ancient world possessed geographic information that modern science only confirmed within the last century. What does it mean when the Earth reveals, through the hand of a long-dead admiral, that someone, at some distant, unrecorded point in time, knew the shape of a continent that would not be seen again for millennia? What does it mean when that knowledge is preserved not in a grand archive or a sacred temple, but on a piece of animal skin, folded away in an Ottoman palace, forgotten until a German theologian found it in 1929? And what does it mean that the original sources, the ancient maps from which all these later copies were derived, have never been found? Perhaps they were destroyed, perhaps they were hidden, perhaps they simply crumbled, the way all things crumble when enough time passes and no one is left who remembers why they mattered. But there is another possibility, one that sits quietly beneath all the others, waiting to be spoken aloud. Perhaps those maps were part of a body of knowledge so vast, so destabilizing to the established order of human history, that their disappearance was not an accident at all. Perhaps they were removed, carefully, deliberately, over centuries, by hands that understood exactly what they contained, and precisely what would happen if the world were allowed to see. The Piri Reis map is a door, and behind it the darkness stretches back much further than 300 years, much further than Alexander, much further than any name preserved in any text still legible today. The question is not whether someone walked through that darkness long before us. The question is what they left behind and who's been making sure we never find it. The source maps vanished. That single fact, quiet as it is, carries an enormous weight because it implies something most people never pause to consider, that the ancient world once held a body of knowledge so complete, so carefully assembled, that it could chart coastlines buried under ice, and yet not a single original document from that body of knowledge has survived into the present day. Where does knowledge go when it disappears? Not a single scroll, not a single inscription, not a single clay tablet preserving the geographic data that Piri Reis and Oronteus Phineas and Philip Boissy clearly drew upon. It is as if someone opened a door into a vast library, copied a handful of pages in haste, and then the library burned. And that image, a library burning, is not a metaphor. It is a memory. One of the oldest and most haunting memories in the story of human civilization. The Royal Library of Alexandria was, by nearly every ancient account, the closest thing the old world ever built to a universal repository of human knowledge. Founded in the 3rd century before the Common Era under the patronage of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, it was designed not merely as a collection of books, but as a living engine of understanding. Scholars were invited from every corner of the known world. Ships arriving in the harbour of Alexandria were searched, not for weapons or contraband, but for scrolls. Any text found aboard was confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and the copy returned to the owner while the original was kept. The ambition was breathtaking in its scope. The Ptolemies did not want to preserve some knowledge. They wanted to preserve all of it. Every philosophical treatise, every navigational chart, every medical text, every astronomical observation, every myth, every history, every song all gathered into one place, organised, cross-referenced, and made available to those with the training to understand it. At its height, the library is believed to have contained somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. To place that number in perspective, the entire surviving corpus of ancient Greek literature, everything that exists today from Homer to Aristotle to the tragedians and beyond, represents perhaps 1 to 2% of what was once written. the rest is gone, and a significant portion of that lost 98% was, at one time, sitting on the shelves of Alexandria. Works by philosophers whose names we will never know. Histories of civilizations whose very existence has been erased from memory. Scientific treatises that may have contained principles not rediscovered until the Renaissance, or not rediscovered yet at all. The scale of what was lost is not merely large. It is, in a very real sense, incomprehensible because we cannot mourn what we cannot remember, and we cannot remember what was taken before we were born. The destruction of the library did not happen in a single dramatic conflagration, as popular imagination often suggests. It was slower than that, more insidious, more deliberate. The first major blow may have come in 48 before the Common Era, when Julius Caesar's forces during the siege of Alexandria set fire to ships in the harbour, and the flames spread to warehouses near the docks, destroying an unknown number of scrolls. But this was likely only a fraction of the collection. The deeper wounds came later. In 273 of the Common Era, the Emperor Aurelian's military campaign damaged the Bruchian district where the main library stood. In 391, the Serapeum, a secondary library and temple complex, was destroyed under the decree of the Christian Emperor Theodosius I, who ordered the demolition of pagan temples throughout the empire. And in the centuries that followed, what remained was scattered, neglected, or deliberately purged by successive rulers who had no use for knowledge that contradicted their own claims to truth. There is something deeply troubling about the pattern of destruction, something that goes beyond the ordinary chaos of war and political upheaval. Each blow to the library coincided with a moment of ideological consolidation, a moment when a new power was asserting control not just over territory, but over the narrative of reality itself. Caesar's fire came during Rome's expansion into the east. Theodosius's decree came during the Christian Church's campaign to eradicate all competing systems of belief and knowledge. The final dispersal of whatever remained came during the early Islamic conquests, though the historical record here is contested and layered with later propaganda. What is not contested is the result. By the time the medieval period settled over Europe like a long cold fog, the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, the astronomical observations, the geographic surveys, the philosophical frameworks, the engineering manuals, the medical knowledge, had been reduced to fragments, scattered quotations in later texts, partial copies of copies, footnotes referencing works that no living person had read in centuries. And here is the question that refuses to dissolve. Was this loss accidental, the unfortunate byproduct of empires clashing and religions warring? Or was it at some level intentional, because there is a profound strategic logic to the destruction of a universal library? If you control what people know, you control what they believe is possible. If you erase the memory of a previous civilization's achievements, its maps, its medicine, its understanding of the stars, then your own civilization becomes by default the pinnacle of human achievement. There is no older, wiser precedent to compare against. There is no record of a world that once knew more than you do. The slate is wiped clean, and whoever holds the pen writes the first line of history as they see fit. Consider what might have been on those shelves. The source maps that Piri Reis referenced, maps of coastlines that had not been visible for thousands of years, may well have been among the holdings of Alexandria or its predecessor collections. The Ptolemies were, after all, obsessed with geography. They commissioned Eratosthenes, the library's third chief librarian, to calculate the circumference of the Earth, which he did with remarkable accuracy in the 3rd century before the Common Era. If Eratosthenes had access to geographic data old enough to show an ice-free Antarctica, would he have recognized its significance? Would he have catalogued it, preserved it, annotated it for future scholars? And if he did, where is that catalogue now? The loss of Alexandria is often treated as a tragedy of the past, a wound that has healed, a fire that has long since cooled. But the wound has not healed, because we do not know its true depth. We do not know what we lost, we only know that we lost something and that the absence is so vast it has shaped the entire architecture of modern knowledge without most people ever noticing. Every history textbook that begins the story of civilization with Sumer around 4000 before the Common Era is making an implicit claim that before Sumer there was nothing. No cities, no navigation, no writing, no science, just scattered bands of hunter-gatherers slowly groping their way toward agriculture and settled life. But the maps suggest otherwise. The engineering of ancient monuments suggests otherwise. And the very existence of a library vast enough to require a staff of hundreds suggests that someone, somewhere, had been accumulating knowledge for far longer than the conventional timeline allows. Who benefits when an entire civilization forgets what it once knew? The answer is always the same. Those who wish to define the present benefit from erasing the past. Those who wish to control the future benefit from ensuring that no one remembers a time when the world was organized differently, when different truths were spoken, when different possibilities were real. And if the Library of Alexandria held even a fraction of what the ancient sources claim, if it truly contained the sum of human knowledge up to that point, then its destruction was not merely a loss, it was an amputation, a deliberate severing of the thread that connected the modern world to whatever came before. But here is the strange thing about threads. Even when they are cut, the fibres remain, scattered, frayed, buried under centuries of dust and dogma, but present, and sometimes in the most unlikely places those fibres surface. In the desert of southeastern Turkey, at the top of a barren hill that should have held nothing of interest to anyone, a German archaeologist in 1994 pressed his shovel into the earth and touched the edge of something that, by every established rule of history, should not have existed at all. The hill had a name, Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly from Turkish as Pot-Belly Hill, and for decades it had been dismissed as nothing more than a medieval cemetery. A survey team from the University of Chicago had visited the site in the 1960s and noted some broken limestone slabs on the surface, but concluded they were remnants of a Byzantine-era burial ground, unremarkable, unworthy of excavation. The slabs were filed away in a brief report, and the hill returned to its silence. Shepherds grazed their flocks across it. Dust settled. 30 years passed, and then Klaus Schmidt arrived. Schmidt was a German archaeologist working with the German Archaeological Institute, and he had spent years studying the Neolithic period in the region. When he visited the hill in 1994, something caught his eye that the earlier survey team had overlooked, or perhaps had not been prepared to see. The limestone fragments scattered across the surface were not random debris. They were too large, too uniform, too deliberately shaped. Schmidt began to dig, and what emerged from the earth over the following years would quietly dismantle one of the most fundamental assumptions in the study of human civilization. Beneath the surface of Göbekli Tepe lay a complex of massive stone circles, constructed from T-shaped pillars weighing between 10 and 20 tons each, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals, foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, serpents, boars, in a style that was at once primitive and extraordinarily sophisticated. The pillars were arranged in concentric rings set into carefully levelled bedrock floors and oriented with a precision that suggested advanced planning and communal coordination on a scale that, according to the established timeline of human development, should have been impossible. Because when the radiocarbon dates came back, they did not point to the Bronze Age or the early Neolithic or even the late Mesolithic. They pointed to approximately 9,500 years before the Common Era, nearly 12,000 years ago. This was a time when, according to the conventional narrative, human beings were still nomadic hunter-gatherers. They had not yet invented agriculture. They had not yet domesticated animals. They had not yet developed pottery, metallurgy, or writing. They were not supposed to have been capable of organized labor, architectural planning, or monumental construction of any kind. And yet, there it was. Carved into the bedrock of a hill in southeastern Turkey, older than Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years, older than the Great Pyramids by more than 7,000 years, older than any known temple, any known city, any known permanent settlement anywhere on Earth. The implications were staggering, and they arrived with a slowness that matched the pace of excavation itself. Each season, as more enclosures were uncovered, at least 20 identified through ground-penetrating radar, though only a handful have been fully excavated, the picture grew more complex and more disturbing to the established order of archaeological knowledge. The carvings were not crude scratchings. They depicted animals with anatomical accuracy, in dynamic poses, with a sense of artistic intention that spoke of a culture with time, resources, and aesthetic sensibility. Some of the pillars bore arms and hands carved in low relief along their shafts, as if the stones themselves were meant to represent anthropomorphic beings, silent figures standing in a circle, watching, guarding, waiting. The arrangement of the enclosures suggested not a settlement but a gathering place, a site of ritual or ceremony to which people travelled from great distances, possibly over generations. Schmidt himself came to a conclusion that inverted the accepted theory of how civilization began. The orthodox view, established in the mid-20th century and still taught in most universities today, holds that agriculture came first. Humans settled down, planted crops, domesticated animals, and the surplus of food allowed for the development of complex social structures, religion, art, architecture, eventually cities. Göbekli Tepe reversed this sequence entirely. Here was monumental architecture, complex, labour-intensive, symbolically rich, and created by people who had not yet begun to farm. The temple, if that is what it was, came before the village. The sacred came before the practical. Belief came before bread. Schmidt proposed that it was the act of gathering at sites like Göbekli Tepe, the communal effort of construction and ritual, that eventually drove the development of agriculture, not the other way around. People needed to feed the labourers who built the monuments. They needed to sustain the gatherings that gave their lives meaning. And so they began to cultivate the wild grains that grew in the surrounding hills, and the long, slow revolution towards settled civilization began, not from the stomach, but from the spirit. But it is what happened to Göbekli Tepe after its construction that deepens the mystery beyond anything Schmidt or his colleagues could comfortably explain. Around 8,000 before the Common Era, the people who had built the site did something extraordinary. They buried it. Deliberately, methodically, they filled in the enclosures with soil, rubble, and animal bones, covering the massive pillars entirely, sealing the site beneath a mound of earth that would, over the millennia, take on the gentle rounded shape that gave the hill its name. This was not the work of a natural disaster, a flood, or an earthquake collapsing the structures. The fill material was brought in from elsewhere, carefully packed around the pillars without damaging them. The site was not destroyed, it was entombed, preserved, hidden. Why would a people bury the most magnificent thing they had ever created? What would compel a civilization, one capable of organizing the labor of hundreds, of carving stone with tools that have never been found, of aligning massive pillars with apparent astronomical precision, to look upon its greatest achievement and decide that the correct course of action was to place it beneath the earth, out of sight, beyond the reach of whatever was to come? There are practical theories, of course. Perhaps the site fell out of use as cultural practices changed. Perhaps the burial was a form of ritual decommissioning, a way of honouring a sacred space by returning it to the ground from which it came. Perhaps it was simply the pragmatic choice of a people who needed the hilltop for something else, a watchtower, a settlement, a field. But there is another possibility, one that aligns with a pattern that will emerge again and again throughout this story. What if they buried it because they knew something was coming? What if the entombment of Göbekli Tepe was not an act of cultural evolution, but an act of preservation, a deliberate choice to protect knowledge from a catastrophe that the builders could see approaching, or perhaps had already survived once before? The timing is suggestive. The burial of the site coincides, within a margin of centuries, with a period of dramatic climatic upheaval at the end of the last ice age, a period that geologists call the Younger Dryas, when global temperatures plunged suddenly, ecosystems collapsed, and the world as it existed was violently reshaped. What if the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not the beginning of civilization, as Schmidt cautiously proposed, but the end of one, the last inheritors of a tradition far older than the stones themselves, racing to preserve what they could before the sky fell and the world they knew was washed away? The stones are still there, standing in their circles beneath the Turkish sun, patient as they have been for 12,000 years. And the earth around them, carefully packed by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, still holds its silence. Whatever the builders intended, whatever message they carved into the pillars and then chose to bury rather than display, it waited in darkness for 100 centuries before Klaus Schmidt's shovel broke the seal. But the seal was not the only thing that broke. Something else fractured that day, something quieter, something structural. The story we had been telling ourselves about who we are and how long we have been here developed a crack. And through that crack, a cold wind blows, carrying with it the scent of something very old and the faint, unsettling sound of a world ending. That cold wind has a name. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas, and for decades it was treated as little more than a curious footnote in the geological record, a brief, anomalous return to Ice Age conditions that interrupted the warming trend at the end of the Pleistocene. The dates are well established. Approximately 12,800 years ago, global temperatures plummeted with a speed that the slow, grinding rhythms of orbital mechanics and ocean circulation could not adequately explain. Within the span of perhaps a single decade, a blink in geological terms, the northern hemisphere was plunged back into near glacial conditions. Forests that had begun to reclaim the tundra died. Animal populations that had been expanding into newly temperate landscapes collapsed. The megafauna of North America, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, species that had survived multiple ice ages over millions of years, vanished almost simultaneously in an extinction so sudden and so thorough that it has never been satisfactorily explained by gradual climate change or human overhunting alone. Something happened, something fast, something violent, and for a long time no one could say exactly what. The conventional explanation for the Younger Dryas focused on ocean currents, specifically the disruption of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation by a massive influx of fresh water from melting glacial lakes. The theory held that a glacial lake in North America, known as Lake Agassiz, had catastrophically drained into the Atlantic, flooding the ocean with enough cold fresh water to shut down the thermohaline circulation and trigger a sudden return to Ice Age conditions. It was a tidy explanation, supported by some evidence, and for years it served as the default answer in paleoclimatology textbooks. But it had problems. The drainage route of Lake Agassiz was never conclusively identified. The volume of fresh water required to produce the observed cooling was difficult to reconcile with the available geological evidence, and the explanation failed to account for some of the strangest features of the Younger Dryas boundary layer. The thin stratum of sediment deposited at the onset of the cold period, which, when examined closely, turned out to contain things that had no business being there. In 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone and Alan West published a paper that proposed a radically different explanation. They called it the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and it suggested that the sudden onset of the cold period was triggered not by the slow failure of ocean currents, but by a catastrophic extraterrestrial impact, a comet or a swarm of comet fragments striking the Earth approximately 12,800 years ago. The evidence they presented was physical, measurable, and deeply unsettling. Across a wide swath of North America, at dozens of sites dated to the Younger Dryas boundary, Firestone and his colleagues found anomalous concentrations of materials that are characteristic of high-energy impacts, Nanodiamonds, microspherules of melted glass and iron, elevated levels of iridium and platinum, and a distinctive layer of carbon-rich sediment consistent with widespread wildfires burning across an entire continent. The nanodiamond evidence was particularly striking. Nanodiamonds form only under conditions of extreme heat and pressure, conditions produced by nuclear detonations, meteorite impacts, or the interior of a star. They do not form in forest fires or volcanic eruptions. Their presence at the Younger Dryas boundary, distributed across a geographic area spanning millions of square kilometers, pointed to an event of extraordinary energy. The hypothesis was controversial from the moment it appeared. Critics challenged the methods, the sample sizes, the interpretation of the data. Some claimed the nanodiamonds were misidentified, or that they could be explained by terrestrial processes. Others pointed out the absence of a definitive impact crater, arguing that without a smoking gun, a clearly identified point of impact, and the hypothesis remained speculative. The debate grew heated, as scientific debates often do when the stakes are not merely academic but existential. Because if Firestone and West were right, the implications extended far beyond geology. They touch the deepest assumptions about the stability of human civilization and the fragility of the world we inhabit. In the years that followed, the evidence continued to accumulate. A 2019 study published in Scientific Reports identified a massive platinum anomaly at the Younger Dryas boundary, across sites in North America, Europe, and the Middle East. A distribution pattern consistent with a large-scale atmospheric event. Research at Abu Huraira in Syria, one of the earliest known agricultural settlements, found nanodiamonds and melt glass at the Younger Dryas layer, suggesting that the site had been subjected to temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius, temperatures achievable only by a cosmic impact or an airburst of similar energy. A 2021 study in the journal Earth Science Reviews compiled data from nearly 200 peer-reviewed papers and concluded that the evidence for a Younger Dryas impact event was robust and growing, though the exact nature and location of the impactor remained subjects of active research. The Hiawatha crater, discovered beneath the ice sheet of northwestern Greenland in 2018, was initially proposed as a possible impact site, though its dating has since been debated. What began to emerge was not a single, clean narrative, but something more complex and more frightening. A picture of a world struck by fire from above at a moment when human civilizations, whatever form they had taken, were at their most vulnerable. The ice sheets were already melting, sea levels were already rising, and into that already unstable world came an event, or a series of events, of such magnitude that it reset the clock of human development entirely. The wildfires alone, if the carbon layer is any indication, may have consumed roughly 10% of the Earth's terrestrial biomass in a matter of weeks. The shockwaves and airbursts would have flattened forests, triggered tsunamis, and destabilized the ice sheets in ways that could account for the sudden flooding and sea level rise preserved in the geological record, and perhaps in the flood myths of cultures on every inhabited continent. And this is where the threads begin to converge. Göbekli Tepe was buried around 10,000 before the Common Era. Within a few centuries of the Younger Dryas onset, the megafauna disappeared. The climate shifted violently, the ice caps destabilized. Sea levels rose by as much as 120 meters over the millennia that followed, swallowing coastlines and low-lying lands across the globe. If there were civilizations in that earlier world, civilizations sophisticated enough to map Antarctica's coastline, to navigate the open ocean, to accumulate the geographic data that would eventually surface in the source maps of Piri Reis, then those civilizations would have existed precisely in the zones most vulnerable to catastrophic flooding: the coasts, river deltas, continental shelves, the places where people have always gathered, because the sea provides food and the rivers provide transport and the flat, fertile land between them provides everything else, and all of those places are now underwater. The conventional timeline of civilization, the one that begins with Sumer around 4000 before the Common Era, is not based on evidence that nothing existed before. It is based on the absence of evidence, and the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly when the places most likely to have harboured early civilizations are now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water, buried under millennia of sediment, or entombed beneath ice sheets that have only recently begun to yield their secrets to radar and satellite imaging. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis does not prove the existence of a lost civilization, but it provides a mechanism, a physical, testable, increasingly well-documented mechanism for how such a civilization could have been destroyed so thoroughly that almost nothing remained. Almost nothing. A few anomalous maps, a buried temple on a hill in Turkey, and the persistent, quiet, unshakable feeling that the story we have been told about the past is missing something enormous. The stones of Göbekli Tepe stand in their circles, carved with images of animals that were already vanishing from the world when the pillars were erected. The Younger Dryas boundary layer lies beneath our feet, a thin dark line in the sediment, a scar across the body of the earth itself. And beneath the ocean, along drowned coastlines and flooded continental shelves, the seafloor holds shapes that sonar has only recently begun to detect, shapes that look, from certain angles and at certain resolutions, unsettlingly like the ruins of things that were never supposed to have existed at all. The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and yet we have mapped, with any meaningful resolution, less than 25% of the seafloor. The figure is worth pausing on, because it reveals something extraordinary about the blind spots in our understanding of the planet we call home. We have detailed topographic maps of Mars. We have high-resolution images of the far side of the Moon. We have catalogued thousands of exoplanets orbiting distant stars. And yet the vast majority of our own ocean floor remains as unknown to us as the interior of Jupiter, a darkness we have chosen, whether by neglect or by something quieter and less comfortable, not to illuminate. When the last ice age ended and the Great Melt began, sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters over a period of several thousand years. That is not a gentle creep. That is the drowning of entire landscapes. Continental shelves that once stretched for hundreds of kilometers beyond the current coastline, plains and river valleys and estuaries where, if human beings behaved then as they have behaved throughout all of recorded history, the densest populations would have lived. The most fertile land, the most accessible harbours, the most developed settlements. All of it now lies beneath the waves, silent, unsearched, and, for the most part, unacknowledged. But the sea does not erase everything. It preserves, it buries. It holds things in the cold and the dark with a patience that makes even stone seem restless. And in certain places, where the currents are gentle and the sediment light, the outlines of what was swallowed can still be discerned, if anyone cares to look. Off the western coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, marine archaeologists using side-scan sonar in 2001 detected what appeared to be the remains of a massive urban settlement submerged beneath nearly 40 meters of water. The site, located near the modern city of Surat, stretched over an area of approximately 9 kilometers, and the sonar images revealed what looked like foundations, walls, and the grid-like pattern of planned streets. Dredging operations brought up artifacts from the seafloor, pottery fragments, beads, a piece of carved wood, and what appeared to be human jawbone and teeth. Radiocarbon dating of the wood sample returned a date of approximately 9,500 years before the present, placing the site thousands of years before the earliest known cities of the Indus Valley civilization. The discovery was announced by the India's National Institute of Ocean Technology, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the timeline of Indian civilization, and perhaps of civilization itself, would have to be dramatically revised. The site was linked, by some researchers and by local tradition, to the legendary city of Dwarka, the kingdom of the god Krishna, described in the Mahabharata as a magnificent coastal city that was swallowed by the sea after Krishna's death. The ancient texts describe the ocean rushing in, consuming the city in a single day, leaving nothing but water where towers and temples had stood. For centuries this was treated as mythology, a poetic fable, nothing more. But the sonar images in the Gulf of Cambay, combined with separate underwater discoveries off the coast of modern Dwarka in Gujarat, where marine archaeologists had already identified submerged stone structures, anchors, and fortification walls, began to suggest that the myth might be a memory, not a literal photographic memory, but the kind of memory that cultures preserve when the event is too vast and too traumatic to be recorded in any other form. A memory wrapped in the language of gods and catastrophe, because the human mind, confronted with the drowning of its entire world, reaches for the only framework large enough to contain the experience. 5,000 kilometers to the east, off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan, a diving instructor named Kihachiro Aratake stumbled upon something in 1986 that has been argued about ever since. Submerged beneath approximately 25 meters of water lay a massive terraced structure, a formation of flat horizontal platforms, sharp right-angled steps, and what appeared to be carved channels and symmetrical features stretching over an area roughly the size of a football field. The Yonaguni Monument, as it came to be known, looked, from almost every angle, like a stepped pyramid or a ceremonial platform, the kind of structure that ancient civilizations across the world built when they wanted to reach toward the sky. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, spent years studying the formation and concluded that it showed clear evidence of human modification, tool marks, consistent angles, features that natural geological processes could not easily explain. He identified what he believed were drainage channels, a road-like feature, and carved symbols resembling animals and human faces. The academic establishment predictably pushed back. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, the same Robert Schoch who would later challenge the dating of the Sphinx, visited the site and acknowledged its unusual features, but ultimately concluded that the structure was most likely a natural formation shaped by the fracturing patterns of the local sandstone, which tends to break along straight lines and right angles. The debate has never been resolved. The Yonaguni Monument sits in a kind of interpretive limbo, too regular to be comfortably dismissed as geology, too ambiguous to be confidently declared architecture. But the question it raises is not really about whether the steps were carved by human hands. The question is about what else lies on the seafloor that no one has looked at carefully enough to argue about at all. In the Bahamas, a formation known as the Beanie Road has provoked similar controversy since its discovery in 1968. A half-kilometre-long arrangement of rectangular limestone blocks lying in shallow water off the coast of North Bimini, the formation was initially hailed by some as confirmation of Edgar Case's prediction that remnants of Atlantis would be found near Bimini. Geologists examined the blocks and declared them natural beach rock, formed by the cementation of coastal sediments, a common geological process in tropical environments. But subsequent studies noted features that complicated the natural explanation: the regularity of the block sizes, the presence of what appeared to be prop stones beneath some blocks as if they had been deliberately levelled, and the alignment of the formation along a northeast-southwest axis that is difficult to attribute to random sedimentation. Once again, the evidence was ambiguous enough to support both interpretations, and once again the deeper question went unasked. If the formation is natural, it is a curiosity. If it is artificial, it is a remnant of a civilization that existed when this area was dry land, which, given the water depth, places it in the late Pleistocene or early Holocene, thousands of years before the earliest known civilizations of the Americas. And then there is what was reported off the western tip of Cuba. In 2001, Paulina Zalitsky, a marine engineer working with the Cuban government on a sonar survey of the seafloor, detected a series of geometric structures at a depth of approximately 600 to 700 meters, far deeper than any known submerged coastal settlement. These sonar images appeared to show pyramidal shapes, rectangular formations, and what looked like roads or pathways connecting them. Zalitsky described the site as resembling an urban complex, and initial media coverage generated worldwide excitement. But the depth posed a profound problem. For that area of seafloor to have been above water, sea levels would have had to be far lower than at any point during the current interglacial period, a scenario that would push the date of any human construction back tens of thousands of years, or require a geological event, such as a localized subsidence or tectonic collapse, that has not been documented. Follow-up investigations were limited, funding was scarce, and the Cuban site faded from public attention as quietly as it had appeared. Each of these sites, taken individually, can be explained away. Natural geology, misidentified formations, insufficient data, over-enthusiastic interpretation. But taken together, they form a pattern that is harder to dismiss, a pattern of anomalous structures lying beneath the ocean, in precisely the places where rising sea levels would have swallowed the coastlines of the ancient world. And the deeper pattern is this. We have not looked. The technology exists. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam bathymetry, remotely operated vehicles, autonomous underwater drones. The tools are available, but the funding is not, and the institutional will is not. And the academic framework within which marine archaeology operates does not encourage expeditions to disprove the established timeline of civilization. The ocean keeps its secrets not because they cannot be found, but because almost no one with the resources and the authority to search has been willing to look in the right places with the right questions. The sea rose, the coast drowned, and whatever was built along those ancient shorelines, whatever cities, whatever harbours, whatever temples and libraries and monuments, sank into a silence that has lasted 10,000 years. But silence is not absence. And the sonar keeps pinging, and the shapes keep appearing, and the questions keep surfacing like debris from a wreck that no one is willing to admit lies on the bottom. Meanwhile, above the waterline on the plateau of Giza, a monument carved from living rock stares eastward into the desert dawn, and the rain scars on its body tell a story that the sand was never meant to reveal. The Great Sphinx of Giza crouches on the edge of the desert like something caught between waking and sleep, its lion body stretched across the limestone bedrock, its human face worn smooth by wind and time and the slow abrasion of centuries. It is the largest monolithic statue in the world, carved directly from the living rock of the Giza Plateau, and it has stared eastward across the Nile Valley for so long that no one can say with certainty when it first opened its eyes. The conventional dating, established by mainstream Egyptology and repeated in virtually every textbook, assigns the Sphinx to the reign of Pharaoh Khafra, around 2,500 years before the Common Era, the same dynasty that built the second of the three Great Pyramids standing behind it. This dating is based primarily on circumstantial evidence. The proximity of the Sphinx to Khafra's pyramid, a partially damaged inscription on a granite stela placed between the Sphinx's paws by a later pharaoh, and the general stylistic assumptions of Egyptian chronology. There is no inscription on the Sphinx itself identifying its builder. There is no contemporary text from the Old Kingdom describing its construction. There is in fact no direct evidence of any kind linking the Sphinx to Khafra or to the Fourth Dynasty at all. The attribution rests on inference, on tradition, and on the deeply human tendency to assign the unknown to the nearest available explanation. And then there is the water. In 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch, a professor at Boston University's College of General Studies, stood at the base of the Sphinx enclosure and saw something that changed the trajectory of his career and, for many who followed the implications, the shape of the ancient past. The walls of the enclosure, the trench carved into the bedrock around the Sphinx when it was originally sculpted, displayed a pattern of erosion that Schoch recognized immediately, not as an Egyptologist, but as a trained geologist accustomed to reading the language of rock. The erosion was not horizontal. It did not follow the flat, layered pattern produced by wind and sand, which is the dominant erosive force on the Giza Plateau today, and has been for thousands of years. Instead, The erosion was vertical, deep, rounded, undulating channels running from top to bottom of the enclosure walls, the unmistakable signature of prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. Water erosion. Not wind, not sand, rain. The distinction matters enormously because the Giza Plateau has not experienced significant rainfall since roughly the end of the Neolithic subpluvial, a wet period that ended around 5,000 years before the Common Era, and in some estimates considerably earlier. If the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure was caused by rain, then the Sphinx must have been carved during or before that wet period, which pushes its date back by thousands of years, potentially to 7,000, 9,000, or even 12,000 years before the present. This would place the Sphinx not in the age of the pharaohs but in the age of Göbekli Tepe, in the shadow of the Younger Dryas, in a world that the conventional timeline insists was populated only by simple Neolithic communities without the knowledge, the organization, or the motivation to carve a 240-foot monument from solid rock. Schoch did not arrive at this conclusion lightly. He presented his findings at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America in 1991, where they were received with interest by his fellow geologists, many of whom agreed that the erosion pattern was consistent with water rather than wind. The response from Egyptologists, however, was immediate and hostile. Mark Lehner, one of the foremost authorities on the Giza Plateau, dismissed the hypothesis outright. Zahi Hawass, then the Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities and the most powerful figure in the Egyptian archaeology, rejected it with visible anger. The pushback was not merely academic. It was institutional, territorial, almost visceral, as if Schoch had not simply proposed a different date for a monument, but had threatened the foundation upon which an entire discipline rested. And perhaps he had. Because if the Sphinx is older than dynastic Egypt, significantly older, by thousands of years, then the questions that follow are not small. Who carved it? What civilization existed on the Nile 7,000 or 10,000 years ago that possessed the skill and the social organization to undertake such a project? Where are the other traces of that civilization, its pottery, its tools, its settlements, its dead? And why does mainstream Egyptology resist so fiercely the possibility that the monuments of Giza might have a deeper history than the one enshrined in the textbooks? The geologist John Anthony West had been asking these questions long before Schoch arrived at the Sphinx. West, a writer and independent researcher who spent decades studying the monuments of Egypt, had drawn on the work of the Alsatian philosopher and mathematician René Schwaller de Lubitsch, who had noted as early as the 1950s that the Sphinx showed evidence of water erosion. West took the observation and ran with it, arguing in his 1979 book Serpent in the Sky that Egyptian civilization did not develop gradually from primitive origins as the standard model holds, but inherited its knowledge, its architecture, its mathematics, its symbolic system from an earlier, more advanced civilization that had been destroyed or dispersed by some catastrophic event. West was not trained as a geologist, and his ideas were dismissed by the academic establishment as speculative mysticism. But when Schoch, a credentialed geologist with no ideological agenda, arrived at the same conclusion through independent analysis of the rock itself, the dismissal became harder to sustain. The resistance of the Egyptological establishment to the water erosion hypothesis reveals something important about the way knowledge is guarded, not by secret societies or shadowy cabals, but by the ordinary mechanics of academic prestige, institutional funding and career survival. An Egyptologist who publicly entertains the possibility that the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt risks more than professional embarrassment. They risk exclusion from the sites themselves because access to the Giza Plateau is controlled by the Egyptian government, and for decades that access was mediated by figures who had made their reputations on the conventional chronology. To challenge the dating of the Sphinx was, in practical terms, to challenge the gatekeepers of the plateau, and the gatekeepers had the power to revoke permits, deny funding, and close doors that might never reopen. The truth in this case was not suppressed by conspiracy. It was suppressed by something far more mundane and far more effective, the professional consequences of asking the wrong question. But the rock does not care about professional consequences. The rock records what happened to it, every drop of rain, every century of wind, every millennium of silence, with a fidelity that no human institution can match or override. And what the rock says in the language that geologists have spent centuries learning to read is that the Sphinx was exposed to prolonged heavy rainfall at a time when the Sahara was not a desert but a green, wet landscape of rivers and lakes and seasonal monsoons. The rock says that the monument was already ancient when the first pharaohs arrived on the plateau and claimed it as their own. The rock says that the conventional dating is, at best, incomplete, and at worst a comfortable fiction maintained by a discipline that has more invested in its own narrative than in the truth carved into the stone beneath its feet. There is one more detail worth holding as the mind drifts further into this story. The Sphinx faces due east. It faces the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the equinox, a direction that has held symbolic significance for virtually every civilization in human history. But due to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift gradually over a cycle of approximately 25,770 years, the constellation that rises on the eastern horizon at dawn changes over time. Today, and for the past 2,000 years, the equinox sun rises in the constellation of Pisces. Before that it rose in Aries, before that in Taurus, and approximately 10,500 years before the Common Era, a date that falls squarely within the range suggested by the water erosion evidence. The equinox sun rose in the constellation of Leo. The lion, a monument in the shape of a lion, facing the exact point where a lion constellation rose at dawn, at a date that the geology itself seems to support. It could be coincidence, it could be projection, pattern seeking, the human mind's relentless desire to find meaning in the arrangement of stones and stars. But it could also be a signature, a date stamp carved not in words but in orientation, left by builders who understood the sky well enough to encode their era into the very posture of the monument they created. The Sphinx stares east. The rain scars run down the walls of its enclosure like tears, and beneath the plateau, sealed behind a locked door that the Egyptian authorities have never permitted researchers to fully explore, ground-penetrating radar has detected a rectangular chamber lying directly beneath the Sphinx's left paw, a void in the bedrock, regular in shape, unmistakably artificial. What is in that chamber? No one outside a very small circle has ever been allowed to find out, and in the silence of that refusal, the questions multiply like echoes in a space much larger and much older than anyone in authority has been willing to admit. But stone is not the only material the ancients used to encode what they knew. There is another medium, older than carving and subtler than architecture, that has only recently begun to yield its secrets to modern instruments, the medium of sound. Sound behaves strangely in certain ancient spaces, not the kind of strangeness that can be attributed to accident or to the natural acoustics of enclosed stone chambers, but a strangeness that suggests intention, a deliberate manipulation of resonance, frequency, and vibration by builders who understood properties of sound that modern science has only recently begun to investigate. This is not speculation layered onto silence, it is measurement, it is data, and the data, gathered over the past few decades by acousticians, archaeologists, and neuroscientists working at sites scattered across 3 continents, tells a story that does not fit comfortably into any conventional narrative about what ancient civilizations knew or what they were capable of achieving. Begin with the Great Pyramid of Giza, not with its dimensions or its alignment or the staggering precision of its construction, all of which have been discussed endlessly, but with what happens when you stand inside it and listen. The King's Chamber, a rectangular room constructed entirely of massive granite slabs deep within the pyramid's interior, resonates at a frequency of approximately 111 Hz. This is not a rough estimate or a mystical assertion. It is an acoustic measurement confirmed by multiple researchers using standard audio equipment. 111 hertz falls within the range of the human baritone voice, and it corresponds closely to a frequency that has been shown in controlled neurological studies to produce measurable effects on the human brain. A study conducted at the University of Malta in 2008, led by archaeoacoustics researcher Ian Cook, used EEG monitoring to observe the brain activity of subjects exposed to sound at 111 Hz. The results showed a distinct shift in brainwave patterns, a reduction of activity in the left prefrontal cortex, the area associated with language processing and analytical thought, and a corresponding increase in activity in regions associated with emotional processing, spatial awareness, and what the researchers cautiously described as altered states of consciousness. At 111 Hz, the thinking mind quiets and the feeling mind awakens. The boundary between self and surroundings becomes less distinct. The experience is not dissimilar to what practitioners of deep meditation describe: a dissolution of ordinary awareness, a sense of expanded presence, a feeling of being inside the sound rather than merely hearing it. The King's Chamber was not designed as a concert hall. Its walls are not shaped to please the ear in the way that a modern auditorium is shaped. They are shaped to do something else, something more precise, more functional, more deliberately engineered. The granite slabs above the chamber are arranged in 5 stacked layers, separated by gaps in a configuration that Egyptologists have traditionally explained as a structural measure to relieve the weight of the pyramid above. But acoustics researchers have noted that this layered arrangement functions remarkably well as a resonance amplifier, a structure that captures and reinforces specific frequencies while dampening others, much like the body of a musical instrument. The chamber does not merely contain sound, it shapes it, it selects it, it tunes the space to a specific vibrational signature, the way a bell is tuned to a specific note. And the note it is tuned to is one that, according to modern neuroscience, alters the way the human brain processes reality. This would be remarkable enough if it were an isolated case, but it is not. 3,000 kilometers to the west, on the island of Malta, beneath the streets of the town of Paola, lies one of the most extraordinary underground structures ever discovered, the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni. Carved from solid limestone over a period that may have spanned centuries, the Hypogeum is a subterranean complex of chambers, halls and passages extending 3 levels deep into the rock, and it is old. Radiocarbon dating of materials found within the complex places its earliest construction phases at approximately 4000 before the Common Era, making it roughly contemporary with the oldest phases of the Egyptian pyramid tradition. But some researchers believe the complex may be considerably older, its deepest levels predating the cultures that later used it as a burial site. When the Hypogeum was first excavated in the early 20th century, the remains of approximately 7,000 individuals were found within it, a number so large that it raises questions about the site's function. Was it a cemetery, a temple, something else entirely? The acoustic properties of the Hypogeum are what set it apart. The so-called oracle room, a small huoba on the 2nd level, carved with unusual precision and featuring a smooth concave niche in one wall, resonates at a frequency of, once again, approximately 111 Hz. When a voice is projected into the niche at the correct pitch, the entire chamber comes alive with vibration. The sound does not simply echo, it envelops. Visitors who have experienced it describe the sensation as being inside the sound, as if the stone itself were humming, as if the walls had become a living membrane transmitting vibrations directly into the body. The resonance is so powerful that it can be felt physically in the chest, in the skull, in the bones. And the frequency at which this occurs is the same frequency measured in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, in a structure built by a different culture, on a different island, separated by thousands of kilometers of open sea. Travel further north, to the east coast of Ireland, to the Passage Tomb of Newgrange, a massive circular mound of stone and earth built approximately 3,200 years before the Common Era, 1,000 years before the Great Pyramid. Newgrange is famous for its winter solstice alignment, during which a narrow beam of sunlight penetrates a specially constructed roof box above the entrance and travels down the 19-metre passage to illuminate the back wall of the central chamber for approximately 17 minutes at dawn. It is a feat of astronomical engineering that has justly earned the site its status as a UNESCO World Heritage Monument. But less widely known is the acoustic research conducted within the chamber by Aaron Watson and David Keating in the late 1990s. Using speakers and precision microphones, Watson and Keating demonstrated that the central chamber of Newgrange resonates at frequencies between 95 and 112 Hz, the same range as the King's Chamber, the same range as the hypogeum. At these frequencies, standing waves form within the chamber, creating zones of intense vibration and zones of near silence, patterns that would have been immediately perceptible to anyone standing inside during a ritual involving chanting or drumming. The convergence is difficult to explain by coincidence. 3 structures on 3 different land masses, built by 3 ostensibly unconnected cultures, spanning a period of more than 2,000 years, and all 3 are tuned to the same narrow frequency range. A frequency range that, according to modern neuroscience, induces measurable changes in brain function. The simplest explanation, that all 3 cultures independently discovered the same acoustic principle through trial and error, is possible but unsatisfying because it assumes that the builders were experimenting blindly without a theoretical framework, without an understanding of what they were doing or why. The precision of the construction argues against accident. These were not rough caves that happened to resonate pleasantly. They were engineered spaces, shaped with painstaking care over generations, using materials chosen and arranged with a specificity that implies deep knowledge of how sound interacts with stone, with air, with the human nervous system. What if there was a framework? What if the builders of these structures were working from a shared body of acoustic knowledge, a science of sound and vibration that understood, millennia before modern neuroscience, that certain frequencies could alter consciousness, induce trance states, facilitate experiences that the builders considered sacred, transformative, or therapeutically valuable? The idea is not as far-fetched as it might initially sound. The ancient Greeks understood the mathematical relationship between musical intervals. The Vedic traditions of India developed elaborate systems of mantra and chant based on the vibrational properties of specific syllables. The Aboriginal Australians used the didgeridoo, an instrument whose fundamental frequency lies in the range of 50 to 200 Hz, in healing ceremonies that may date back tens of thousands of years. Across cultures and continents, the oldest spiritual traditions are rooted not in abstract theology, but in direct experience induced, shaped, and guided by sound. And here is the question that lingers in the resonant air of these ancient chambers, long after the instruments have been packed away and the researchers have returned to their universities. If the ancients understood sound as a technology, not a metaphor, not a decoration, but a functional tool for altering human perception, and perhaps for purposes we have not yet imagined, then what else did they understand? What other technologies, embedded in the architecture of monuments we think we have fully explained, are hiding in plain sight, waiting not to be discovered but to be recognized? The stones of the King's Chamber hum at 111 Hz when struck. The walls of the hypogeum amplify the human voice into something that ceases to be sound and becomes sensation. The passage of Newgrange channels winter light and winter vibration into a single point at a single moment once a year. These are not the achievements of people who are just learning how the world works. These are the achievements of people who knew something about the relationship between matter, energy, and consciousness that has since been forgotten, or dismissed, or buried beneath the accumulated assumptions of a civilization that has convinced itself it stands at the pinnacle of all knowledge. but the stones remember. And when the right frequency fills them, they speak in a language older than words, older than writing, older perhaps than the cultures that carved them. And if the ancients could shape sound with such precision, one wonders what else they shaped, what mechanisms, what instruments, what devices might have existed in a world that the passage of millennia and the destruction of libraries have reduced to mystery. Because in a few places, scattered across the archaeological record like pieces of a machine whose purpose has been forgotten, objects have surfaced that do not belong to the ages in which they were found. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers working off the coast of the tiny island of Antikythera, wedged between Crete and the Peloponnese, descended into water roughly 60 meters deep and found the remains of a Roman-era shipwreck scattered across the seafloor. The wreck yielded the usual treasures of ancient maritime trade: bronze and marble statues, pottery, glassware, jewellery, coins dated to the 1st century before the Common Era. But among the artefacts brought to the surface was a lump of corroded bronze and wood, roughly the size of a shoebox, so encrusted with marine deposits that it was initially set aside as unremarkable. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens for months, slowly drying, before anyone noticed that the corrosion was cracking apart to reveal something inside. A system of interlocking gears, finely toothed, precisely cut, arranged in a configuration of such mechanical complexity that it would not be matched by any known European technology for more than 1,000 years. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be called, was an analog computer. Not a computer in the modern electronic sense, but a mechanical device designed to calculate and display astronomical information: the positions of the sun and moon, the phases of the moon, the timing of eclipses, and possibly the positions of the 5 planets known to the ancient world. It contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, some with teeth less than a millimeter in size, arranged in a differential gear train that could model the irregular elliptical orbit of the moon using a pin and slot mechanism of extraordinary ingenuity. The sophistication of its engineering was not merely impressive for its era. It was, for decades after its discovery, literally incomprehensible. Scholars could not believe that the ancient Greeks possessed the metallurgical precision, the mathematical knowledge, or the mechanical imagination to produce such a device. It was treated as an anomaly, a one-off, a curiosity, a freak of the archaeological record that could be admired but not integrated into the broader narrative of technological progress. But the Antikythera mechanism is not the kind of object that appears from nowhere. Complex machines are not invented in isolation. They are the products of traditions, of generations of refinement, of incremental improvements, of earlier prototypes that are tested, modified, and improved upon. A device with 30 gears implies a device with 20, which implies a device with 10, which implies a body of mechanical knowledge extending back centuries before the final product was assembled. The Roman orator Cicero, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, described seeing a mechanical device built by Archimedes that displayed the motions of the sun, moon, and planets. A description that sounds remarkably like the Antikythera mechanism or something very close to it. If Archimedes, who lived in the 3rd century before the Common Era, had already built such a device, then the tradition of precision-geared mechanisms in the ancient Mediterranean world was at least 2 centuries old by the time the Antikythera ship sank. And if the tradition was that old, where are the other devices? Where are the prototypes, the failed experiments, the simpler models from which the final design evolved? They are gone, lost to shipwrecks, to corrosion, to the melting down of bronze for weapons and coins, to the systematic destruction of knowledge that followed the fall of the ancient world. The Antikythera mechanism survived only because it sank to the bottom of the sea where no one could repurpose its gears or burn the library that explained how it worked. The implications are worth sitting with. If a civilization could build a mechanical computer 2,000 years ago, a device so sophisticated that its operating principles were not fully understood until 21st century X-ray tomography revealed the inscriptions hidden inside its corroded fragments. Then what else could that civilization build? And more to the point, what did it build that did not survive? The mechanism we have is a single artifact recovered from a single shipwreck, preserved by the accident of submersion. How many similar devices were built and lost? How many were melted down, taken apart, or simply discarded when the knowledge required to understand them faded from living memory? The archaeological record is not a complete inventory of what once existed. It is a scattered collection of whatever happened to survive, a tiny biased sample of the material culture of the past, distorted by the uneven forces of preservation and destruction. And the Antikythera mechanism is not the only object that does not fit. In 1936, during the excavation of a Parthian-era site near Baghdad, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig discovered a set of clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods, arranged in a configuration that bore an unmistakable resemblance to a galvanic cell and an electrochemical battery. The so-called Baghdad battery, dated to approximately 200 years before the Common Era, generated immediate controversy. When replicas were constructed and filled with an acidic solution such as vinegar or grape juice, they produced a measurable electric current. Small but real. What the device was used for remains unknown. Suggestions have ranged from electroplating, a process that could explain the unusually fine gold coatings found on some Parthian-era artifacts, to pain relief, to ritual applications involving mild electric sensation. Skeptics have argued that the jars were simply storage vessels, and that the galvanic configuration was coincidental. But the fact remains that the physical assembly of the objects produces electricity, and that no one has offered a fully satisfying alternative explanation for why copper and iron were arranged in precisely the configuration that maximizes electrochemical potential inside a sealed clay container. Then there is Roman concrete. The Pantheon in Rome, completed around 125 of the Common Era, is topped by an unreinforced concrete dome that spans 43 meters. A record that stood for over 1,000 years and that remains, in certain respects, unmatched today. Modern Portland cement concrete begins to degrade within decades, cracking under the stress of environmental exposure, requiring constant maintenance and eventual replacement. Roman concrete, by contrast, has survived nearly 2 millennia of exposure to rain, seismic activity, and, in the case of marine structures, continuous immersion in seawater. A study published in 2017 in the journal American Mineralogist, led by geologist Marie Jackson of the University of Utah, revealed part of the reason for this extraordinary durability. Roman maritime concrete made with volcanic ash and seawater undergoes a long-term chemical reaction in which aluminous tobermorite crystals grow within the concrete matrix over time, actually strengthening the material as it ages. Modern concrete weakens with age. Roman concrete gets stronger. The Romans, working with materials and techniques that were lost after the fall of the empire, had produced a building material that is, in measurable chemical terms, superior to anything available today. The formula was not preserved. The knowledge was not transmitted. It was simply forgotten, buried under the rubble of a civilization that collapsed and left its secrets in the walls of buildings that no one, for centuries, bothered to analyze. And at the edge of these lost technologies sits an object so small and so strange that it seems almost to belong to another world entirely. The Lycurgus cup, a Roman glass cage cup dated to the 4th century of the Common Era, now housed in the British Museum, displays a property that was not understood until the development of nanotechnology in the late 20th century. When lit from the front, the cup appears opaque green. When lit from behind, it glows a deep translucent red. The effect is caused by the presence of nanoparticles of gold and silver embedded in the glass, particles approximately 70 nanometers in diameter, smaller than a wavelength of visible light, dispersed with a uniformity that suggests deliberate manufacturing control at a scale that modern science did not achieve until the 1970s. The Romans who made the Lycurgus cup were working at the nanoscale. Whether they understood the physics of what they were doing, whether they had a theoretical framework for manipulating particles too small to see, or whether they stumbled upon the effect through centuries of empirical glass-making tradition, the result is the same. An object exists in a museum in London that demonstrates a level of material control which the modern world considers a recent achievement. Each of these artifacts, the mechanism, the battery, the concrete, the cup, is treated by the academic mainstream as an isolated curiosity, a dead end, a remarkable but ultimately inconsequential footnote in the grand narrative of human progress. But what if they are not isolated? What if they are fragments of a much larger body of technological knowledge that once existed in the ancient world? A body of knowledge that was not primitive, not accidental, not the product of blind trial and error, but systematic, sophisticated, and far more advanced than the societies that came after, were capable of understanding or preserving. The loss of Roman concrete alone set back construction technology by a millennium. The loss of the Antikythera tradition set back mechanical engineering by at least as long. What other losses have occurred that we cannot even identify, because the artifacts did not survive, and the texts that describe them were consumed in the fires that swallowed the libraries of the ancient world? The past is not a straight line climbing upward from ignorance to enlightenment. It is a landscape of peaks and valleys, of rises and collapses, of knowledge gained and knowledge lost, sometimes gradually through the slow erosion of tradition, and sometimes violently through conquest, destruction, and the deliberate suppression of everything that does not serve the interests of the new order. And if the physical evidence suggests that the ancient world was more technologically capable than the standard narrative allows, then the written record may hold its own surprises, chronicles so ancient and so strange that they have been dismissed as mythology, even though they describe in language that predates science a world that lasted far longer and reached far higher than anyone has been comfortable admitting. Somewhere in the clay tablets of Sumer, in numbers so large they seem absurd, the kings of the oldest civilization left a record of how long they ruled. And the numbers, like so much else in this story, do not make any sense at all, unless the story we have been told about the past is missing something fundamental. The Sumerian king list is one of the oldest known documents in human history, inscribed on clay tablets and stone prisms in cuneiform script by the scribes of ancient Mesopotamia, and its contents present a problem that no scholar has ever been able to resolve without resorting to the word myth. The list catalogues the rulers of Sumer from the very beginning, from what the scribes called the moment when kingship descended from heaven, and it proceeds through a series of dynasties, naming kings, their cities, and the length of their reigns with the matter-of-fact precision of an administrative record. The early entries are where the trouble begins. According to the list, the first kings of Sumer ruled for periods that stretch beyond any plausible human lifespan. Alulim, the first king of the city of Eridu, is recorded as having reigned for 28,800 years. His successor Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. The reigns of the antediluvian kings, those who ruled before the Great Flood described in the list, total 241,200 years, distributed among 8 kings in 5 cities. Then the list states simply, the flood swept over. And after the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more, and the reigns of subsequent rulers gradually shortened to durations that begin to approach the biologically possible. Hundreds of years, then decades, then the recognizable lifespans of historical monarchs whose existence can be confirmed by other records. The conventional academic response to the antediluvian section of the king list has been to classify it as mythology, a symbolic or legendary preamble attached to an otherwise historical document, reflecting the Sumerians' desire to anchor their civilization in a divine or primordial past. The long reigns are interpreted as literary conventions, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals, or using a numerical system whose units do not correspond to solar years as we understand them. These explanations are reasonable. They are also incomplete because they do not address the deeper question of why the Sumerians, meticulous record keepers whose administrative archives have survived in the hundreds of thousands, would attach fictional data to a document whose purpose was clearly bureaucratic and historical. The later portions of the King List are remarkably accurate, matching archaeological evidence and cross-references from other ancient sources with a precision that suggests the scribes took their work seriously. Why would they invent the earlier entries? Or, more unsettlingly, why would they preserve them from an even older source whose original context had already been lost? The Sumerians were not the only ancient civilization to record impossibly long chronologies. In Egypt, the Turin Royal Canon, a papyrus dating to the reign of Ramesses II, around 1270 years before the Common Era, lists the rulers of Egypt from the beginning of time. The early sections of the papyrus, heavily damaged but partially legible, describe a period when Egypt was ruled by gods and demigods for thousands of years before the first human pharaohs took the throne. The god Ptah is recorded as having reigned for 9,000 years. The reign of Ra spans 1,000 years. The demigods who followed ruled for additional millennia. The total span from the beginning of divine rule to the first human dynasty, according to the Turin Papyrus, exceeds 30,000 years. The 3rd century Egyptian priest Manetho, who compiled a history of Egypt in Greek for the Ptolemaic court, preserved similar figures describing a period of divine and semi-divine rule lasting over 24,000 years before the first dynasty. Modern Egyptology treats these figures exactly as Sumerology treats the antediluvian king list, as mythological embellishment, symbolic chronology, priestly invention. The numbers are filed under legend and the conversation moves on. But the numbers keep appearing. In India, the concept of the yugas, the great ages of cosmic time described in the Vedic and Puranic literature, posits cycles of civilization lasting millions of years, during which humanity rises to extraordinary heights of knowledge and spiritual attainment and then gradually declines into ignorance and disorder before the cycle resets. In China, the legendary emperors of the pre-dynastic period are described as ruling for hundreds of years each, possessing knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and agriculture that they bestowed upon humanity as divine gifts. In the Hebrew Bible, the patriarchs before the flood live for extraordinary spans. Methuselah for 969 years, Noah for 950, Adam for 930. In the Mesoamerican long count calendar used by the Maya, time is measured in units called baktons and alautons that extend back millions of years into the past, to a zero date that has no relationship to any known event in Mayan history, but that the Maya themselves treated as cosmologically significant, a starting point for the current age of the world, preceded by other ages that had risen and fallen in their turn. The pattern is global. It is not confined to one culture, one continent, one linguistic family, or one religious tradition. From Mesopotamia to Egypt to India to China to Mesoamerica, the oldest civilizations on Earth, independently recorded chronologies that extend far beyond the boundaries of what modern scholarship considers possible, describing eras of advanced knowledge, divine or semi-divine rulers, and catastrophic resets that separated one age from the next. The standard academic explanation that these are all independently invented myths, products of the universal human tendency to mythologize the past, is possible, but it requires a remarkable coincidence that dozens of unconnected cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, all independently invented the same basic narrative structure. A golden age of knowledge, a long decline, a catastrophic flood, and a new beginning from which the current civilization descended. There is another possibility, one that sits beneath the academic consensus like groundwater beneath stone, invisible but present. What if the long chronologies are not invention but memories, not literal records, not transcripts of events witnessed and recorded in real time, but the deeply compressed, symbolically encoded residue of a historical reality so distant that it could only be preserved in the language of myth. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis provides a mechanism for the catastrophic reset. The submerged coastlines of the post-glacial world provide a location for the lost civilizations. The anomalous maps, the impossible artifacts, the acoustically engineered temples, all of these provide fragments of evidence that something existed before the accepted beginning of history. And the ancient chronologies, dismissed as fantasy by modern scholars, may be the closest thing we have to a direct testimony from the survivors. Consider Plato. In two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 years before the Common Era, Plato describes a powerful island civilization called Atlantis, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which flourished approximately 9,000 years before the time of Solon, the Athenian lawmaker who reportedly heard the story from Egyptian priests at the Temple of Neith in Sais. If Solon's visit to Egypt occurred around 600 before the Common Era, then Plato's date for Atlantis places it at approximately 9,600 years before the Common Era, squarely in the window of the Younger Dryas. Plato describes Atlantis as a maritime civilization of great sophistication, organized in concentric rings of water and land, possessing advanced engineering, a powerful navy, and a culture that eventually succumbed to moral corruption and was destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the ocean and vanishing from the memory of all but the Egyptian priests who had preserved the account in their temples. The academic mainstream has always treated the Atlantis story as a philosophical allegory, a fictional construct invented by Plato to illustrate his ideas about the corruption of ideal societies. This is the safe reading, the one that keeps the boundaries of acceptable scholarship intact. But there are problems with it. Plato's dialogues are filled with fictional devices and thought experiments, but he explicitly distinguishes the Atlantis account from fiction. He has the character of Critias insist that the story is true, heard from Solon, who heard it from the Egyptians, who had it inscribed on the walls of their temples. Plato attributes the story not to his own imagination, but to a chain of transmission extending back through centuries of oral and written tradition to the oldest literate civilization in the Mediterranean world. He provides specific geographic and temporal details, the location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the date of 9,000 years before Solon, the nature of the destruction, that go far beyond what a simple allegory would require. None of this proves that Atlantis existed, but it does suggest that Plato was drawing on a tradition, a body of transmitted knowledge about the deep past that circulated among the priestly and scholarly classes of the ancient world, and that was treated, by those who preserved it, as historical rather than fictional. The Egyptian priest told Solon that the Greeks were children, that they had no memory of the ancient world because their records had been repeatedly destroyed by floods and fires, while the Egyptians, protected by the Nile and the desert, had maintained their archives for thousands of years. What was in those archives? What did the priests of Neith know about the world before the flood? And when those archives were finally lost, absorbed into the Library of Alexandria, which was itself destroyed, did the last thread connecting the modern world to the antediluvian past finally snap? The flood narratives are perhaps the most universal motif in all of human mythology. More than 200 cultures across every inhabited continent preserve stories of a great deluge that destroyed a previous world and from which a small number of survivors emerged to begin again. The Sumerian flood story, predating the biblical account of Noah by more than a millennium, describes the god Enki warning the kings Yasudra to build a boat and preserve the seed of humanity. The Hindu Matsya Purana tells of the god Vishnu appearing as a fish to warn Manu of a coming flood. The Aztec myth of the fourth sun describes a world destroyed by water. The Aboriginal Australian Sea and stories of the Dreamtime include accounts of a great inundation that reshaped the coastline, stories that remarkably have been shown by geologists to correspond to actual sea level changes that occurred more than 7,000 years ago. Preserved in oral tradition, with an accuracy that defies the assumption that mythology is merely fantasy. If these are memories, they are memories of a world that ended, and the civilizations that emerge from the wreckage, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the early cultures of China and Mesoamerica, may not have been the first chapter of the human story, but the second, or the third, or the 10th. The long chronologies may be counting backward not through invention, but through recollection, reaching toward a past so distant that only numbers and gods remain to mark its passage. And if that past was real, then the keepers of its memory, the priests, the scribes, the custodians of the oldest temples, would have held knowledge of incalculable value, knowledge that someone somewhere may still be holding, in a city built on 7 hills, behind walls that have stood for nearly 2,000 years. There is a door that leads to 53 miles of shelving, and behind that door, in climate-controlled darkness, the silence is so complete that even time seems to have stopped moving. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, renamed from the Vatican Secret Archives in 2019, in what some saw as an attempt to soften an increasingly uncomfortable public perception, is housed in a complex of rooms, vaults, and climate-controlled chambers beneath and adjacent to the Vatican Library in Vatican City. The word secret in its original Latin designation, Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, technically means private rather than hidden, referring to the personal archives of the Pope as distinct from publicly accessible church records. But the distinction between private and hidden has always been, in practice, vanishingly thin. The archive contains an estimated 85 kilometers of shelving, roughly 53 miles, holding documents that span more than 12 centuries of papal history, from the 8th century of the Common Era to the present. Scholars are permitted limited access by application, but only to documents more than 75 years old, and only with specific research justifications approved by the archival staff. No general browsing is allowed. No comprehensive catalogue has ever been made public, and vast sections of the collection have never been examined by anyone outside the Vatican's own circle of appointed researchers. What is in there? The honest answer is that no one outside the Vatican knows the full extent of the holdings, and this uncertainty is itself the most significant fact about the archive. What is publicly known offers tantalizing fragments. The archive contains correspondence between the papacy and virtually every major political power in European and Mediterranean history, letters from monarchs, treaties, diplomatic dispatches, reports from papal legates stationed in courts and colonies around the world. It holds the records of the Inquisition, including trial transcripts and interrogation documents spanning several centuries. It contains the papal bull Inter Caetera of 1493, in which Pope Alexander VI divided the newly discovered lands of the Americas between Spain and Portugal. It holds letters from Michelangelo, from Henry VIII requesting an annulment, from Mary Queen of Scots pleading for her life. These are the items that the Vatican has chosen to publicize, the carefully curated highlights of a collection whose true depth remains unmeasured. But the political correspondence, however historically valuable, may be the least interesting portion of the archive. The Catholic Church spent the better part of 2 millennia as the dominant institutional power in the Western world, and during that time it served not only as a religious authority, but as the primary custodian, and, when it chose, the primary suppressor of knowledge. During the late Roman period and throughout the medieval era, the Church was the institution that decided which texts would be copied and preserved and which would be allowed to decay, which ideas would be taught and which would be condemned, which accounts of the past would be transmitted to future generations, and which would be erased from the record entirely. The monasteries of Europe, operating under Church authority, were the principal centres of manuscript production for nearly 1,000 years. Every text that survived the collapse of the Roman world did so because a monk somewhere decided it was worth copying. And every text that did not survive may have perished not by accident but by omission, a quiet, deliberate decision, repeated across centuries, to let certain knowledge die. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, was formally established by Pope Paul IV in 1559, though the practice of banning and burning books considered dangerous to church doctrine had been ongoing for centuries before that. The index remained in effect until 1966, more than 400 years during which the Church maintained an official list of texts that Catholics were forbidden to read, possess, or distribute. The list included works by Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, and hundreds of other thinkers whose ideas challenged the Church's authority over the interpretation of the natural world, the cosmos, and the nature of human existence. The stated purpose of the index was the protection of faith and morals. The practical effect was the systematic suppression of any intellectual framework that threatened the Church's monopoly on truth. But the index dealt with relatively recent works, products of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment. The deeper question concerns what happened to the much older texts, the pre-Christian manuscripts, the classical and late antique documents, the Gnostic scriptures, the Hermetic writings, the philosophical and scientific texts of the pagan world that passed through church hands during the centuries when the church was the only institution with the resources and the infrastructure to preserve written knowledge. Some of these texts survived, copied by monks who recognized their intellectual value even as they disapproved of their theological content. Aristotle's works, for instance, were preserved through Arabic translations that re-entered Europe via Islamic Spain in the 12th and 13th centuries. But for every Aristotle who survived, how many other thinkers did not? How many texts on astronomy, on medicine, on the nature of matter, on the history of civilizations older than Rome, were quietly allowed to crumble or actively destroyed because their contents contradicted the Church's narrative of creation, of time, of humanity's place in the cosmos? The Gnostic texts offer a suggestive parallel. In 1945, a collection of early Christian and Gnostic manuscripts was discovered, sealed in a clay jar near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, texts that had been buried probably in the 4th century, when the Church was consolidating its authority and declaring competing Christian sects heretical. The Nag Hammadi library included the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and dozens of other texts that presented radically different accounts of creation, divinity, and the nature of human consciousness than the Orthodox Christian canon. These texts had been systematically suppressed by the early Church, their possession criminalized, their copies destroyed, their ideas condemned as heresy. They survived only because someone, at some point in the 4th century, chose to bury them in the desert rather than surrender them to the flames. For 1600 years, an entire tradition of early Christian thought existed only in the denunciations of its enemies, in the polemics of church fathers who quoted Gnostic ideas solely for the purpose of refuting them. The discovery at Nag Hammadi revealed that the version of Christianity that triumphed, the version that became the foundation of Western civilization, was not the only version, and perhaps not even the earliest. It was simply the one that had the institutional power to destroy its competitors. If texts that threatened the Church's theological authority were systematically suppressed, what happened to texts that threatened its historical authority? What happened to documents describing civilizations that predated the biblical timeline of creation? What happened to accounts of the deep past that contradicted the Church's insistence that the world was created in 6 days approximately 6,000 years ago? Archbishop James Ussher's calculation, published in 1650, placing the date of creation at October 23rd, 4004 years before the Common Era, was not merely an intellectual exercise. It was the official chronology of the Christian world for centuries, and any document suggesting a deeper human past, any record of civilization stretching back tens of thousands of years, any chronicle of knowledge predating the Garden of Eden, would have been not merely inconvenient but heretical. The Church did not simply control what people believed about God, it controlled what people believed about time, about how old the world was, about how long humanity had existed, about whether there was a past before the past it authorized. Consider the centuries of colonial expansion, during which Catholic missionaries accompanied European conquerors into the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. In Mesoamerica, the Spanish conquest was accompanied by a systematic campaign of cultural destruction that targeted the written records of the Maya, the Aztec, and other indigenous civilizations. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan bishop of Yucatan, ordered the burning of thousands of Maya codices in 1562, an act that destroyed the vast majority of Maya written knowledge in a single afternoon. Only 4 Maya codices are known to survive today. The justification was religious. The codices were deemed instruments of the devil, filled with pagan superstition and demonic imagery. But the codices also contained astronomical calculations of extraordinary precision, historical chronicles extending back for thousands of years, and mathematical and calendrical systems that rivaled or exceeded anything in contemporary Europe. Their destruction was not merely a religious act, it was an epistemic one, an erasure of an entire civilization's understanding of time, the cosmos, and the deep past, replaced by the Church's own narrative of creation and history. How many other such erasures have occurred? How many texts, artifacts, and records from ancient civilizations were absorbed into church collections during the long centuries of its dominance and simply never seen again? The Vatican Archive is 53 miles of shelving, and only a fraction of it has been examined by independent scholars. The Vatican Library, a separate institution, holds over 80,000 manuscripts and more than 1.6 million printed books, many acquired from collections across the former Roman Empire and beyond. Among those holdings, catalogued under classifications that may not reflect their true nature, stored in rooms that independent researchers may never be permitted to enter, there may be documents that rewrite the history of human civilization, or there may not. The point is that no one outside the Vatican can say with certainty, and the Vatican has never demonstrated any urgency about letting the rest of the world find out. The silence of the archive is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of containment, the particular heavy quiet of a room in which something is being held, deliberately, behind walls thick enough to outlast centuries. And while the archive keeps its patience in the cool darkness beneath Rome, the questions continue to multiply. Because the Church is not the only institution that has ever controlled the flow of knowledge, and written records are not the only medium through which the ancient world communicated what it knew. In the high desert of southern Peru, etched into a plateau so dry that the lines carved into its surface have endured for more than 1,000 years, there are messages that were never meant to be read from the ground. Messages so large, so precise, and so purposeful that they can only be seen in their entirety from the sky. The lines stretch across the Nazca Plateau in southern Peru, like the thoughts of a mind too vast to think in words. Hundreds of them, some running straight as laser beams for kilometers across the flat, sun-baked desert, others curving into shapes that only resolve into meaning when seen from above. A hummingbird, its wings spread across 93 meters of desert floor. A spider, anatomically precise, 66 meters from leg tip to leg tip. A monkey with a spiraling tail. A condor with a wingspan of over 130 meters. Geometric figures, trapezoids, triangles, spirals, zigzags, carved into the reddish pebble surface of the pampa by the simple method of removing the oxidized top layer of stones to reveal the lighter ground beneath. The lines are shallow, only 10 to 30 centimeters deep in most places, and yet they have survived for more than 1,000 years in a landscape so arid that it receives less than 25 millimeters of rainfall per year. A landscape where the air is so still that the stones once moved stay moved, and the messages carved into the earth remain legible across millennia. The Nazca lines were not unknown to the people who lived near them. Local inhabitants had always been aware of the straight lines and cleared areas that crossed the plateau, though their ground-level perspective would have made the larger figures impossible to perceive as coherent images. It was not until the 1920s and 30s, when commercial aircraft began flying over the Nazca Desert, that pilots looked down and saw what no one standing on the ground could see. Enormous drawings of animals and geometric shapes spread across the plateau with a precision and a scale that seemed almost impossible for a pre-industrial culture to achieve without the ability to observe their own work from above. The discovery prompted a question so basic that it feels almost naive, and yet no one has ever fully answered it. Who were these images made for, if they can only be seen from the sky, and the people who made them could not fly? Then who was supposed to look at them? Maria Reiche, a German mathematician and archaeologist who devoted more than 50 years of her life to studying and preserving the Nazca lines, believed the figures were an enormous astronomical calendar, a tool for tracking the movements of the sun, moon and stars across the desert sky, with the lines pointing toward key celestial events such as solstices, equinoxes, and the rising and setting points of important stars. Reiche's work was meticulous and deeply personal. She lived near the lines for decades, mapping them by hand, sweeping the desert floor with a broom to reveal faded markings, and fighting relentlessly against development and vandalism that threatened the site. Her astronomical hypothesis explained the straight lines convincingly. Many of them do align with celestial events, but it struggled to account for the animal figures, which do not correspond neatly to any known astronomical pattern. Why would a calendar need a picture of a hummingbird? Why would a star chart require a spider drawn at a scale visible only from the heavens? Other researchers proposed different explanations. The American anthropologist Paul Kosok, who studied the lines in the 1940s, described them as the largest astronomy book in the world. The British explorer Toni Morrison suggested they were sacred pathways, ritual walking routes connected to water and fertility rites. The archaeologist Johann Reinhard argued that the lines were part of a religious landscape oriented toward mountain worship and the veneration of water sources, linking the geoglyphs to the sacred geography of the Andes. Each of these explanations captures something real about the lines, and none of them captures everything. The Nazca lines resist singular interpretation. They are too large, too varied, too precise, and too deliberately designed to be reduced to a single function. They feel like a message, but a message in a language that no one alive today fully understands, written by a people who either could not or chose not to leave a translation. The precision of the figures is worth pausing on, because it speaks to a level of planning and spatial awareness that complicates the standard image of the Nazca culture as a relatively simple agricultural society. The hummingbird figure, for example, is composed of a single continuous line that never crosses itself, a feat of geometric planning that would challenge a modern designer working with graph paper and software, let alone an ancient artist working on a scale too large to perceive from the ground. Studies have shown that the figures could have been produced by scaling up smaller drawings using a system of grids and stakes, a method well within the technological capabilities of the Nazca people. But the ability to execute a design is not the same as the motivation to conceive it. The question is not how they drew a 93-meter hummingbird. The question is why. What purpose is served by an image that the artist, standing at ground level, could never see in its completed form? What drives a culture to create something whose meaning can only be apprehended from a vantage point it does not possess? The Nazca lines are not unique. Across the globe, ancient cultures carved enormous images and geometric patterns into landscapes that can only be fully appreciated from above. In England, the Uffington White Horse, a highly stylized chalk figure dating to approximately 1000 before the Common Era, is carved into a hillside in such a way that its form is most coherent when viewed from directly above or from a great distance, not from the valley below. In the desert of the American Southwest, enormous intaglios, figures of humans and animals scraped into the desert floor, are found along the lower Colorado River, some exceeding 50 meters in length. In Kazakhstan, more than 50 geoglyphs, including enormous geometric shapes and what appears to be a swastika, an ancient symbol of the sun long predating its 20th century appropriation, were identified through satellite imagery in 2014, some dating back more than 2,000 years. In Saudi Arabia, thousands of stone structures called mustatills, some over 600 meters long, have been documented from the air, dating to approximately 5000 before the Common Era, and their purpose remains entirely unknown. The global distribution of these earth markings raises a question that is rarely asked in academic circles, perhaps because the implications are too disruptive. If these figures were designed to be seen from above, and their creators had no means of aerial observation, then there are only a few possible explanations. The first is that the figures were made for gods, for divine beings imagined to be watching from the sky, whose attention the earthbound artists sought to attract or appease. This is the most comfortable explanation, the one that fits within the standard framework of religious and ceremonial behavior. The second is that the figures served a practical function, astronomical alignment, territorial marking, water management, that did not require aerial observation, and their visibility from the sky is merely a coincidence of scale. This explanation works for some of the lines, but fails to account for the figurative images, which serve no obvious practical purpose. And the third possibility, the one that is almost never spoken in academic settings, but that hangs in the air like a scent no one wants to identify, is that the creators of these figures could, in some way that has been lost to history, see their own work from above, that they possessed a means of aerial observation, whether technological or perceptual, that has left no trace in the archaeological record, or no trace that has been recognized. The Nazca people themselves left behind more than lines in the desert. Their civilization, which flourished along the southern coast of Peru, from approximately 100 before the Common Era to 800 of the Common Era, produced extraordinary polychrome pottery, elaborate textiles, and a sophisticated system of underground aqueducts called puquillos that tapped into subterranean water sources and channeled them to the surface through spiraling stone-lined tunnels. Some of these aqueducts are still in use today, more than 1500 years after they were built. The engineering required to locate subterranean water, calculate the correct depth and angle for the tunnels, and construct them with enough precision to maintain a steady flow over centuries implies a body of hydraulic knowledge that was both practical and profound. These were not primitive people scratching pictures in the sand. They were engineers, artists, astronomers, and builders whose achievements rival those of any ancient civilization, and their greatest work, the lines themselves, remains, after decades of study, fundamentally unexplained. The hummingbird still hovers on the desert floor, frozen in flight, its wings outstretched toward a sky it was clearly meant to face. The spider still waits, its body rendered with such anatomical precision that arachnologists have identified the species, a member of the genus Riccinulae, a rare and reclusive arachnid whose reproductive organ is visible only under microscopic examination, and yet the Nazca artist depicted it on a scale of 66 meters. How did they know? How did they see what can only be seen with magnification, and then render it at a scale that can only be seen from the sky? The question is absurd in its implications and unanswerable in its precision, and it sits on the surface of the Nazca Plateau like the lines themselves, visible, undeniable, and utterly resistant to any explanation that does not require us to reconsider what the ancient world was capable of knowing. But perhaps the answer is not above us, perhaps it is below, because while the Nazca lines point toward the sky, other ancient civilizations directed their most ambitious construction downward, into the earth itself, carving entire cities into solid rock, descending level after level into the darkness beneath the surface, as if they were fleeing something that was coming from above, or seeking something that could only be found in the deep places where sunlight never reaches and the weight of the world presses in from every side. Beneath the town of Derinkuyu in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, carved into the soft volcanic tuff that blankets the landscape like a pale, solidified breath, lies a city that descends 18 stories into the earth. It was rediscovered in 1963 when a local resident knocked down a wall in his basement during renovations and found himself staring into a passageway that led downward into darkness. That darkness, as subsequent excavation revealed, contained an underground complex of staggering scale, a subterranean city capable of sheltering approximately 20,000 people along with their livestock and food supplies, connected by a labyrinth of tunnels, ventilation shafts, wells, storage rooms, chapels, and communal living spaces, all carved by hand from the soft but durable rock. Massive circular stone doors, weighing up to 500 kilograms each, could be rolled into place from the inside to seal the entrances, turning the entire complex into a fortress that was virtually impenetrable from above. The ventilation system alone, a network of more than 50 shafts reaching to the surface, engineered to circulate fresh air to the deepest levels, demonstrates a mastery of subterranean architecture that would be challenging to replicate with modern tools. Derinkuyu is not alone. The Cappadocian landscape harbours more than 200 underground cities of varying sizes, connected in some cases by tunnels stretching for kilometres between them. Makli, another major underground city located roughly 10 kilometres from Derinkuyu, extends at least 8 levels deep and may have been connected to Derinkuyu by a tunnel nearly 9 kilometres long, though this passage has never been fully explored. The conventional dating of these cities places their most extensive development in the Byzantine period, when Christian communities used them as refuges from Arab raids in the 7th and 8th centuries. But there is evidence that the earliest levels are considerably older. Some archaeologists attribute the initial excavation to the Phrygians, around the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era. Others suggest that the deepest chambers may date back even further, to the Hittite period or beyond, though the difficulty of dating carved rock, which cannot be radiocarbon tested, makes firm chronological claims elusive. What is not elusive is the question of purpose. Why would anyone carve a city 18 stories deep into the earth? The standard explanation, refuge from invasion, is plausible for the upper levels, which show clear signs of defensive adaptation. But the sheer depth of the complex, the sophistication of its engineering, and the scale of the undertaking suggest something more than a temporary hiding place from raiders. 20,000 people could live underground at Derinkuyu. They could bring their animals, seal the doors, breathe through ventilation shafts, draw water from underground wells, and wait. But wait for what? A raid lasts days, perhaps weeks. A siege might last months. The infrastructure at Derinkuyu suggests preparation for something longer, something more total, a period of sustained surface uninhabitability that would require not just shelter, but a complete alternative living environment, self-contained and self-sustaining, carved into the bones of the earth as if the surface of the world could no longer be trusted. The idea that civilizations might have been driven underground by catastrophic surface events is not confined to Cappadocia. Across the ancient world, myths and traditions describe a descent into the earth, not as death or punishment, but as survival, as preservation, as a deliberate withdrawal from a world that had become hostile. The Hopi people of the American Southwest preserve oral traditions describing a series of world ages, each ending in destruction, during which the faithful were guided underground to emerge into the next world when the surface became habitable again. The Zoroastrian texts describe Yima, a legendary king, being instructed by the god Ahura Mazda to build an underground enclosure of Vara to protect the seeds of all living things from a devastating winter that would cover the earth. The parallels with the biblical story of Noah are obvious, but the medium of survival is inverted. Noah builds upward. Floating above the flood, Yima builds downward, sheltering beneath the storm. Both respond to the same fundamental threat, the destruction of the surface world. The deeper one looks into humanity's relationship with the underworld, the stranger the picture becomes. In the 18th century, the English astronomer Edmund Halley, the same Halley who predicted the return of the comet that bears his name, proposed a theory that the Earth was hollow, consisting of concentric spherical shells separated by atmospheres, each potentially capable of supporting life. Halley's hypothesis was not idle speculation. It was an attempt to explain anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field, which he believed could not be accounted for by a solid, uniform interior. His idea was taken seriously by the scientific community of his time, debated in the pages of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and gradually set aside as advances in seismology and geophysics painted a more detailed picture of the Earth's interior. By the 20th century, the hollow Earth theory had been relegated to the fringes of science, kept alive primarily by enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists who lack the institutional credibility to influence mainstream discourse. And yet the Earth's interior remains, in important ways, a place of profound uncertainty. The deepest human beings have ever penetrated into the planet is the Kola Super Deep Borehole, a Soviet-era drilling project on the Kola Peninsula in northwestern Russia that reached a depth of 12,262 meters, approximately 12 kilometers, before the project was abandoned in 1992. 12 kilometers sounds impressive until one considers that the Earth's radius is approximately 6,371 kilometers. The Kola borehole scratched less than 0.2% of the way to the center of the planet. Everything beyond that point is inferred, modeled through the analysis of seismic waves, extrapolated from laboratory experiments on minerals under extreme pressure, estimated using mathematical models that are sophisticated but ultimately indirect. No human being has ever seen, touched, or directly measured the Earth's mantle, let alone its core. Our knowledge of the planet's interior is, in the most literal sense, second-hand, a picture assembled from vibrations and equations, not from observation. The Kola borehole itself produced surprises that unsettled the geologists who oversaw the project. At depths below 7 kilometers, the rock was found to be far more fractured and porous than models had predicted, saturated with water in zones where no water was expected to exist. The temperature gradient was steeper than anticipated, reaching 180 degrees Celsius at the final depth, a temperature that softened the rock to the consistency of plastic and made further drilling impossible with the technology available. The project revealed that even the most basic assumptions about the Earth's shallow crust were, in some respects, wrong. What lies deeper in the vast unsampled volume between 12 kilometers and 6,000 remains a domain of educated guessing. The models are good, they are consistent with the available data, but they are models, not measurements, and the history of science is littered with models that were consistent with available data until new data arrived and the models collapsed. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, signed by 12 nations and now adhered to by more than 50, designates the entire continent of Antarctica as a scientific preserve, prohibiting military activity, mineral mining, and nuclear testing, and establishing freedom of scientific investigation across the continent. On its surface, the treaty is a model of international cooperation, a rare example of nations setting aside their competitive instincts to protect a pristine environment for the benefit of all humanity. But certain provisions of the treaty and the practical realities of its enforcement have raised questions among those who pay close attention to the politics of polar access. Independent exploration of Antarctica is, for all practical purposes, impossible. Access is controlled by national Antarctic programs, which are funded and administered by tumor governments. The logistics of reaching the continent, the specialized equipment, the fuel, the ice-breaking vessels, the survival infrastructure, place it beyond the reach of any individual or private organization without state-level resources. The continent is, in effect, the most restricted landmass on Earth, not by the force of arms, but by the force of logistics and bureaucracy. What is beneath the Antarctic ice? The conventional answer is rock, a continental landmass buried under an ice sheet averaging over 2 kilometers in thickness, a remnant of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana, geologically unremarkable except for its extreme environment. But the ice itself has only recently begun to yield its secrets to modern sensing technology. Subglacial lakes, bodies of liquid water trapped beneath the ice sheet, kept from freezing by geothermal heat and the insulating weight of the ice above, have been discovered in increasing numbers. Lake Vostok, the largest, lies beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice and covers an area comparable to Lake Ontario. It has been sealed from the atmosphere for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. What lives in that water? What lies on the lake bed? When Russian scientists finally drilled through to the lake's surface in 2012, the samples they retrieved were controversial, some showing signs of microbial life, others potentially contaminated by the drilling fluid. The full story of Lake Vostok remains untold, and the extreme difficulty of accessing it ensures that it will remain so for years, perhaps decades to come. The earth hides things in its depths the way the ocean hides things on its floor, not by active concealment but by sheer inaccessibility, by the weight and darkness and pressure that make the deep places of the world as alien to us as the moons of Jupiter. We have sent probes to the outer reaches of the solar system. We have photographed the event horizon of a black hole. We have mapped the cosmic microwave background radiation from the first moments after the birth of the universe. And yet we do not know what lies 12 kilometers beneath our feet, let alone 1,200, let alone 6,000. The Earth's interior is, in the most precise and humbling sense, unknown territory, a volume of space greater than all the planets we have ever studied, existing right beneath us, separated from our world by nothing more than rock and heat and the limits of our ability to dig. And if the Earth holds secrets in its crust and its mantle and its ice, it holds perhaps the deepest secret of all, in a place far more intimate and far less explored than any borehole or subglacial lake. That place is not beneath the ground, it is inside the body. Inside every cell, coiled in the nucleus like a scripture written in a language that took billions of years to compose, there is a record of everything that has ever happened to life on this planet. A record so dense, so ancient, and so imperfectly understood that some of the most distinguished minds in molecular biology have wondered aloud whether it was written by chance alone, or whether something else, something deliberate and purposeful, left its signature in the architecture of the molecule that makes us what we are. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs of DNA, a molecular manuscript of staggering length, coiled and folded into the nucleus of nearly every cell in the body, encoding the instructions for building and maintaining an organism of extraordinary complexity. When the Human Genome Project completed its first draft sequence in 2003, after 13 years of work and nearly $3 billion of investment, researchers expected to find a tidy, efficient blueprint, a well-organized manual in which every section had a clear function and every gene played an identifiable role. What they found instead was something far stranger. Of the 3 billion base pairs, only about 1.5% coded for proteins, the functional molecules that carry out the work of the cell. The remaining 98.5% appeared at first glance to do nothing at all. It was labelled junk DNA, a term coined with the casual dismissiveness of a discipline that assumed it had already grasped the basic architecture of life and needed only to fill in the details. That assumption has aged poorly. In the years since the Human Genome Project, research has increasingly revealed that the so-called junk DNA is not junk at all. The ENCODE project, a massive international effort launched in 2003 to catalogue the functional elements of the human genome, published its initial findings in 2012 in a coordinated release of 30 papers, concluding that at least 80% of the genome, far more than the 1.5% that codes for proteins, serve some biochemical function. Regulatory sequences, enhancers, promoters, silencers, non-coding RNAs, transposable elements, the genome turned out to be not a simple instruction manual, but an enormously complex regulatory network, a system of systems in which the silent regions play roles as critical as the genes themselves, controlling when and where and how genes are expressed, modulating the intricate dance of cellular development with a subtlety that molecular biology is still struggling to comprehend. The junk was not junk, it was infrastructure, the operating system beneath the software, the architecture beneath the architecture, a layer of biological information so deep and so densely interwoven that decades of research have only begun to map its outlines. And within this genome, in a place so fundamental that it touches the very identity of what it means to be human, there is an anomaly that has never been fully explained. Human beings have 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. Every other great ape, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, bonobos, has 48 chromosomes arranged in 24 pairs. The difference is not trivial. Chromosome number is one of the most basic structural features of an organism's genome, and a change in chromosome number typically represents a major evolutionary event. In the case of humans, the discrepancy was resolved in 1982, when molecular biologist Jorge Yunes demonstrated that human chromosome 2 is the product of an ancient fusion. Two separate chromosomes, corresponding to chromosomes 12 and 13 in chimpanzees, fused end-to-end at some point in the human lineage to create a single larger chromosome. The evidence for the fusion is clear. Human chromosome 2 contains vestigial telomere sequences, the repetitive DNA caps that normally appear only at the ends of chromosomes, in its interior precisely where two chromosome ends would have joined. It also contains a vestigial centromere, a second inactive centromere in addition to the functional one, marking the location where two separate chromosomes became one. The fusion is not in dispute. What is in dispute, or rather what is rarely discussed, is the mechanism by which such a fusion became fixed in the human population. Chromosomal fusions are rare events, and when they occur, they typically produce individuals who are reproductively disadvantaged, because their unusual chromosome number makes successful meiosis, the process of cell division that produces eggs and sperm, less likely. For a fusion to become universal in a species, it must either confer a significant selective advantage, or it must occur in a very small, isolated population where genetic drift can fix the change by chance. The standard explanation invokes the latter, a population bottleneck in the human lineage, during which a small group of individuals carrying the fused chromosome became the ancestors of all subsequent humans. This is a plausible explanation. It is also, in its way, a confession of ignorance, because it does not explain why the fusion happened, what triggered it, or what, if any, functional consequences it produced. It simply notes that it occurred and that the math of small populations allows such things to become permanent. But there is a deeper strangeness to the human genome that extends beyond chromosome 2, the story of human evolution, as told by molecular biology and paleoanthropology, contains a chapter that remains stubbornly resistant to explanation: the rapid expansion of the human brain. Over a period of roughly 2 million years, from Homo habilis to Homo sapiens, the hominin brain tripled in size, from approximately 400 cubic centimeters to roughly 1,350. This is one of the fastest rates of organ growth observed in the mammalian fossil record, and no fully satisfying explanation has been offered for what drove it. Brain tissue is extraordinarily expensive to maintain, consuming roughly 20% of the body's energy at rest, despite comprising only about 2% of its mass. Natural selection does not favor expensive organs without a compelling reason. What was the pressure, environmental, social, dietary, or otherwise, that made a larger brain so overwhelmingly advantageous that it justified the enormous metabolic cost? The dietary hypotheses, the social brain hypothesis, the sexual selection hypothesis, all capture fragments of the picture, but none fully accounts for the speed and scale of the expansion. And then there is the deeper mystery, the one that sits beneath the gradual narrative of brain growth like a fault line beneath a familiar landscape. The emergence of behaviorally modern Homo sapiens, beings who produce symbolic art, buried their dead with ritual objects, made complex tools from multiple materials, and appeared to possess language, occurred relatively suddenly in the archaeological record. appearing in Africa somewhere between 300,000 and 70,000 years ago, depending on which markers of modernity are used. The Great Leap Forward, as it was once called, now more cautiously termed the Upper Paleolithic Revolution or the emergence of behavioural modernity, represents a transition so dramatic that some researchers have struggled to explain it through gradual evolutionary processes alone. The anatomical equipment was largely in place for tens of thousands of years before the behavioural change appeared. The hardware existed. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the software came online. It was this kind of discontinuity that led Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, a Nobel laureate, and one of the most influential biologists of the 20th century, to propose in a 1973 paper co-authored with Leslie Orgel the hypothesis of directed panspermia. Crick and Orgel suggested that life on Earth may not have originated on this planet at all, but may have been deliberately seeded by an intelligent extraterrestrial civilization that sent microorganisms to Earth aboard a spacecraft designed for the purpose. The hypothesis was not offered as a joke or as science fiction. It was offered as a serious scientific proposal, rooted in the observation that the origin of life on Earth remains one of the most intractable problems in biology. That the transition from non-living chemistry to the first self-replicating molecular system is so improbable, so poorly understood, and so unsupported by any demonstrated mechanism, that the possibility of an external origin deserves consideration alongside the more conventional hypotheses of abiogenesis. Crick later expanded on the idea in his 1981 book Life Itself, in which he noted several features of Earth's biochemistry that he found suggestive of a common origin. The universality of the genetic code, for instance, which is shared by all known life on Earth with only trivial variations, as if every organism on the planet descended from a single molecular template. The genetic code is not the only possible code. There is no chemical reason why the same codons must specify the same amino acids in every organism from bacteria to blue whales. And yet they do. The code is universal, as if it were installed once, in one place and never revised. This universality is conventionally explained by common descent from a single ancestor, the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA. But Crick noted that common descent does not explain why the code is the way it is, why this particular mapping of codons to amino acids was selected, or why no alternative codes have ever been observed. The code works, but so would other codes. Its universality, Crick suggested, might reflect not the inevitability of chemistry, but the intentionality of design. These are dangerous ideas in the currency of institutional science, and they are offered here not as claims but as questions. Questions posed by one of the most credentialed scientists in history. A man who understood the structure of DNA better than almost anyone alive, and who nevertheless looked at the molecule he had helped to decode and found it strange enough to wonder whether it had been written rather than evolved. The Cambrian explosion, that astonishing burst of biological diversity approximately 540 million years ago, during which most major animal phyla appeared in the fossil record within a span of roughly 20 million years, a geological blink, adds another layer to the puzzle. Before the Cambrian, life on Earth was predominantly simple, single-celled or colonial. After the Cambrian, the oceans teemed with complex, differentiated organisms possessing eyes, shells, limbs, digestive systems, and nervous systems. No gradualist mechanism has fully explained the speed and scope of this diversification. The genetic toolkit required for animal body plans appeared with a rapidity that continues to challenge evolutionary theory, and the trigger, whether environmental, genetic, or something else entirely, remains one of the great unsolved problems in biology. What if the greatest secret the Earth is hiding is not buried in its crust or submerged beneath its oceans or locked in the vaults of ancient institutions, but woven into the fabric of every living cell? What if the code that makes us what we are, the double helix, the universal language of adenine and guanine and cytosine and thymine, carries within it the signature of something older and stranger than the planet itself? The question is not whether this is true, The question is whether we are willing to look at the evidence without the protective lens of assumptions that we have mistaken for knowledge, and to sit with the possibility that the story of life on Earth, like the story of civilization, may be far longer, far more complex, and far less accidental than anyone has been comfortable admitting. And if the code in our cells whispers of an origin we do not fully understand, then perhaps the ancients, who spoke of gods descending, of knowledge bestowed, of a golden age before memory, were not inventing. Perhaps they were remembering in the only language they had, something that the molecule in their blood had always known, but that the conscious mind, trapped in its narrow slice of time, could never quite articulate. The philosophers of the ancient world had a word for this kind of knowledge that is felt rather than learned, recognized rather than discovered, as if the truth were not arriving from outside but surfacing from within, rising through layers of forgetting like light through deep water. In the 4th century before the Common Era, in a dialogue that would echo through every subsequent century of Western thought, Plato described a group of prisoners chained inside a cave, facing a blank wall, unable to turn their heads. Behind them burned a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, figures moved, carrying objects whose shadows were cast upon the wall. The prisoners, having known nothing else, believed the shadows were reality. They gave the shadows names. They studied their patterns. They built an entire understanding of the world based on the flickering, flat projections of something they had never seen directly. And when one prisoner was freed and dragged out of the cave into the sunlight, the pain of seeing the real world, the overwhelming brilliance of unmediated reality, was so great that he wanted to return to the comfortable darkness, to the familiar shadows, to the version of truth that did not burn. Plato's allegory of the cave is typically taught as a lesson in epistemology, a philosophical argument about the difference between perception and reality, between the world as it appears to the senses and the world as it truly is. But there is something in the allegory that goes beyond academic philosophy, something that resonates with a frequency far older than the Greek tradition from which it emerged. The image of human beings trapped in a limited reality, mistaking shadows for substance, unaware of a deeper or higher truth that exists just beyond their perception. This is not an idea that Plato invented. It is an idea that surfaces independently and repeatedly across civilizations and millennia, as if it were not a philosophical proposition at all, but a memory, a recognition, a persistent intuition embedded in the human experience itself. The Maya of Mesoamerica conceived of time not as a line, but as a wheel, or rather a series of interlocking wheels, vast cycles of creation and destruction through which the cosmos turned with the regularity of a machine. The Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Kichi Maya, describes a succession of world ages, each populated by different beings, each ending in catastrophe. The gods of the first creation made humans from mud, but they were weak and dissolved in water. The second creation produced beings of wood, but they lacked hearts and minds and were destroyed by a great flood. The third creation, the current age, produced humans from maize, and these beings could see and understand everything so clearly and so completely that the gods, alarmed by the perfection of their creation, deliberately clouded human vision, limiting their perception the way breath clouds a mirror. The implication buried in the myth is extraordinary. Humanity once saw clearly, and that clarity was taken away, not by accident, not by decay, but by intentional design. These shadows on the wall were placed there on purpose. Half a world away, the Hindu philosophical tradition developed a concept that mirrors this intuition with striking precision. Maya, a Sanskrit word that shares no etymological root with the name of the Mesoamerican civilization, but carries a hauntingly similar meaning, refers to the illusory nature of the perceived world. In Advaita Vedanta, the non-dualist school of Hindu philosophy articulated most fully by the 8th century thinker Shankara, the material world is Maya, not unreal in the sense of being non-existent, but unreal in the sense of being a projection, a veil a shimmering surface that conceals a deeper undifferentiated reality called Brahman. The individual self, the Atman, is not separate from this ultimate reality. It is Brahman experiencing itself through the distorting lens of Maya, the way a dreamer is both the dreamer and the dream. Liberation moksha consists not in escaping to another place but in waking up, in recognizing that the separation between self and cosmos is an illusion, and that the prison is not made of walls but of perception. The Buddhists arrived at a parallel conclusion through a different path. The concept of samsara, the cycle of birth, death and rebirth, describes existence as a wheel from which the unenlightened cannot escape, not because the wheel is locked, but because they do not realize they are on it. The Buddha's central teaching, that suffering arises from attachment to impermanent things, is at its deepest levels an assertion about the nature of reality itself, that the world as ordinarily perceived is a construct, a web of mental fabrications mistaken for solid ground, and that true liberation comes from seeing through the construct to whatever lies beneath. The metaphor of the cave is not used, but the structure is identical: shadows, chains, the possibility of awakening, and the terrible difficulty of convincing those who are still chained that what they see is not all there is. What is remarkable is not that one civilization arrived at this insight, but that so many did, independently, across such vast distances of time and geography. The Australian Aboriginal concept of the dreamtime, the Jukurpa, describes a layer of reality that exists beneath or within the ordinary world, a foundational realm in which the ancestral beings shaped the land, the laws, and the patterns of existence. The dreamtime is not the past in the Western sense, is an ongoing, ever-present dimension of reality that the initiated can access through ceremony, song, and the sacred relationship with landscape. The visible world is a surface. The real world is underneath, woven into the songlines that crisscross the continent, connecting sacred sites in patterns that map not just geography, but the deeper structure of being itself. Aboriginal Australian culture, which may represent the oldest continuous cultural tradition on Earth. Oral histories that have been shown to preserve accurate descriptions of geographic features and climatic events, stretching back more than 10,000 years, treats the idea that visible reality is a thin film over something vaster and more fundamental, not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a practical, lived daily truth. In the 20th century, this ancient intuition found an unexpected echo in the language of physics. Quantum mechanics revealed that the subatomic world does not behave according to the rules that govern the everyday world of tables and chairs and falling apples. Particles exist in superposition, in multiple states simultaneously, until they are observed, at which point they collapse into a single state. Entangled particles influence each other instantaneously across any distance, violating the classical assumption that nothing can travel faster than light. The observer and the observed are not independent. The act of measurement changes the thing being measured. Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Niels Bohr's complementarity, the double-slit experiment that demonstrates the wave-particle duality of matter, all point toward a reality in which the solid, objective, observer-independent world of classical physics is, at the most fundamental level, not solid, not objective, and not independent of consciousness. The physicist John Wheeler, who coined the term black hole and spent decades at the frontier of theoretical physics, proposed in his later years a concept he called the participatory universe, the idea that the universe does not exist independently of observation, but is, in some deep sense, brought into being by the act of being observed. Wheeler's phrase "it from bit" encapsulated his intuition that the fundamental substance of reality is not matter, but information, that the physical universe is, at its base, a vast computational process, and that what we experience as material existence is the output of something more abstract, more mathematical, more akin to code than to substance. The parallels with ancient descriptions of Maya, of the dreaming, of shadows on a cave wall, are not lost on those who study both physics and philosophy. The language is different. The mathematical formalism is new. But the core insight that reality is not what it appears, that the visible world is a projection of something deeper, that consciousness plays a role in the constitution of the physical, is as old as recorded thought. In 2003, the philosopher Nick Bostrom of the University of Oxford published a paper titled "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" that formalized in the language of probability theory, an argument that the ancients had been making in the language of myth for millennia. Bostrom's simulation argument proposes that at least one of three propositions must be true: that virtually all civilizations at our level of development go extinct before reaching the technological capability to run detailed simulations of consciousness, that virtually all such civilizations choose not to run such simulations, or that we are almost certainly living inside a simulation. The argument is not a claim that we are in a simulation. It is a logical structure that demonstrates that the possibility cannot be dismissed on purely rational grounds, that the probability of being a simulated consciousness in a simulated universe may be, depending on the assumptions one feeds into the calculation, disturbingly high. The paper generated enormous debate in philosophy, physics, and computer science, and it has never been convincingly refuted. What Bostrom articulated with equations, the Gnostics articulated with theology. The Gnostic traditions of the early Common Era, the texts buried at Nag Hammadi, the teaching suppressed by the Orthodox Church, describe the material world as the creation not of the true God, but of a lesser, ignorant deity called the Demiurge, who fashioned the physical cosmos as a prison for divine sparks of consciousness that had become trapped in matter. The visible world in Gnostic thought is not a gift but a cage, and the way out is not faith or obedience but gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of the true nature of reality, a knowledge that the Demiurge and his agents work tirelessly to suppress. The structural similarity to the simulation argument is striking. An artificial reality created by a lesser intelligence. Consciousness trapped within a constructed system. Liberation through understanding the nature of the construct. The vocabulary changes, the insight does not. And so the question that has been building throughout this journey, what is the earth hiding, turns inward, folding upon itself like the double helix, like the spiraling geoglyphs of Nazca, like the concentric circles of Göbekli Tepe's stone enclosures. What if the thing that is hidden is not an object or a place or a document locked in a vault, but a truth about the nature of reality itself? A truth that the oldest civilizations understood, that the mystics and philosophers encoded in allegory, that the physicists stumbled upon in their equations, and that the structures of power, from ancient priesthoods to modern institutions, have always had reason to obscure, not because the truth is dangerous in the way a weapon is dangerous, but because it is dangerous in the way that awakening is dangerous. Because once you see, you cannot unsee, and the systems that depend on the sleeping obedience of the unawakened cannot survive the opening of too many eyes. The cave is quiet now, the fire flickers, the shadows dance on the wall in patterns that almost make sense, that almost tell a story, that almost resolve into a shape the mind can name, and somewhere in the space between the fire and the wall, something moves, not a shadow but the thing that casts it, solid and real and patient, waiting for someone to turn around. But there is still one more place to look before the turning, one more layer beneath the layers, one more question that has been present since the very first word of this journey but has not yet been spoken aloud. A question not about what the earth is hiding from us, but about what the earth remembers, silently in the language of stone and ice and deep time, about everything that has ever walked upon its surface and everything that has ever been forgotten. The earth does not forget. It cannot. Forgetting is a luxury of consciousness, a mercy granted to minds that would break under the weight of total recall. And the earth has no mind, only memory, vast and indifferent and absolute, written in languages that do not require understanding to endure. every footprint pressed into mud 3 million years ago in Latoli, Tanzania. The trail of an Australopithecus walking upright through volcanic ash, preserved in stone with such fidelity that the arch of the foot and the push of the toes are still legible, is a sentence in that language. Every layer of sediment laid down on the ocean floor, every ring in the heartwood of a bristlecone pine, every bubble of ancient atmosphere trapped in Antarctic ice, every stratum of rock compressed and folded and uplifted and eroded and compressed again over billions of years, all of it is memory. Not the selective, narrative memory of a mind telling itself a story, but the total unedited memory of a body that records everything and curates nothing, that preserves the catastrophe and the calm with equal indifference, that does not distinguish between what matters and what does not, because to the earth everything matters equally, which is to say nothing matters at all, which is to say that meaning is something we bring to the record, not something the record provides, and what a record it is. The geological column, the layered stack of rock and sediment that constitutes the Earth's crust, is a document of approximately 4.5 billion years, a manuscript whose earliest pages are so worn and overwritten that they can barely be read, and whose most recent pages, the thin, fragile layer of the Holocene, the 11,700 years since the end of the last ice age, the era in which everything we call civilization has occurred, are so thin, so recent, so superficial in comparison to the vast bulk beneath them, that they could be scraped away with a fingernail and the earth would not notice. The entirety of recorded human history occupies a sliver of time so narrow that if the age of the earth were compressed into a single calendar year, human civilization would not appear until the final fraction of the last second before midnight on December 31st. We are an afterthought, a postscript, a note scribbled in the margin of a book so long that no one has ever read it from beginning to end, and yet we behave as if the book were written for us, as if the earth were a stage set for the human drama, as if the 4.5 billion years that preceded our arrival were merely prologue, mere preparation for the moment when a species capable of asking questions would finally appear and begin the real story. This is not arrogance in the petty personal sense. It is something deeper, a structural assumption embedded in the way we organize knowledge, write history, and interpret the past. We begin the story of civilization at Sumer, around 4000 before the Common Era, not because we have evidence that nothing existed before, but because that is where our records begin, and we have confused the beginning of the record with the beginning of the thing recorded. It is as if a person who lost their memory in an accident believed they were born on the day they woke up in the hospital, mistaking the first thing they can remember for the first thing that ever happened. The evidence gathered throughout this journey, the anomalous maps, the destroyed libraries, the buried temples, the catastrophic impacts, the drowned coastlines, the rain-scarred monuments, the resonant chambers, the impossible artifacts, the impossible chronologies, the sealed archives, the sky-facing messages, the underground cities, the coded genome, the recurring philosophical intuition that reality is not what it seems. None of it constitutes proof of any single alternative narrative. There is no thesis here, no grand unified theory of the hidden past, no villain to unmask, and no revelation to deliver wrapped in a bow of certainty. What there is instead is a pattern of absence, of erasure, of a knowledge that surfaces briefly and then disappears, of questions that are asked and then quietly filed away, of doors that are found and then locked, of threads that are pulled and then cut. The pattern does not tell us what was lost. It tells us that something was lost, and the shape of the absence, like the shape of a fossil pressed into stone, the organism gone, the impression remaining, may be the closest we can come to seeing what is no longer there. Perhaps this is the nature of the thing. Perhaps the earth hides what it hides not through malice or conspiracy, but through the simple, implacable mechanics of deep time. Stone erodes, wood rots, metal corrodes, paper burns, languages die and take their meanings with them. Civilizations rise and flourish and produce astonishing works of knowledge and beauty, and then collapse, not because they are conquered, but because the conditions that sustain them shift. The rains fail, the soil depletes, the climate turns, the comet falls, and what took centuries to build is unmade in a generation, and what took generations to learn is forgotten in a century. And the forest grows over the ruins, and the sea rises over the coast, and the dust settles over the last legible inscription, and the silence that follows is so complete that the next civilization to arise in that place begins from scratch, believing itself to be the first, because there is no one left to tell it otherwise. This has happened before. The geological record is clear on this point, even if the archaeological record is not. Life on Earth has been interrupted at least 5 times by mass extinction events, catastrophes so severe that they eliminated between 70 and 96% of all species alive at the time. The Permian-Triassic extinction 252 million years ago killed approximately 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. The Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction 66 million years ago ended the reign of the dinosaurs. Each time life recovered. Each time the recovery took millions of years. Each time the new world that emerged bore little resemblance to the one that had been destroyed. The Earth does not mourn its dead. It simply starts again with whatever is left, and the new tenants of the surface have no idea what walked there before them. We are the new tenants, and the house is very old, and the walls are thick, and the basement is deep, and the attic is sealed, and the garden is overgrown with plants whose roots reach down into soil that was laid before any human hand touched the earth. And somewhere in that house, in a locked room, in a forgotten drawer, in a crack in the foundation that opens onto darkness, there may be a record of the previous tenants, a note left behind, a mark scratched into the stone by someone who lived here before us and wanted to be remembered, or perhaps simply wanted to warn us about something about the house itself, something about the way it shifts and settles, and occasionally, without warning, shakes. The earth turns in darkness, as it has always turned, holding its memories in stone and ice and the slow, patient language of geology. The stars wheel overhead in patterns that the ancients mapped and named and used to navigate across oceans that would later swallow the coast they sailed from. The wind moves across the surface of the world, carrying dust from places that were once cities, pollen from plants that were once cultivated by hands long since turned to soil, and sounds, faint, almost inaudible, the residue of every vibration that has ever moved through the atmosphere, that dissipate but never entirely disappear, spreading outward at the speed of sound into a silence that is not empty but full of everything that has ever been spoken and sung and wept and whispered on this small, ancient, impossibly patient world. The questions remain. They will always remain, not because the answers do not exist, but because the answers may be of a kind that cannot be spoken, only recognized the way a sleeper recognizes the moment just before waking, when the dream is still present, but the light is already pressing against the eyelids, and the body knows, before the mind does, that it is time to open its eyes, but not yet, not quite yet. For now the earth holds what it holds, and the night is deep, and the silence is kind, and somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the stone, beneath the ice, beneath the ocean, beneath the skin, something ancient is dreaming, and the dream is almost ready to be remembered.